Lord of Mystery, Mr. Witch and Miss Hunter by author Xian Dian Li. Chapter 351-370. Chapter 351, Going Deeper. While Vianata and Audrey were discussing future business strategies, Sophie and Ask were discussing their own matters in a room downstairs. This was originally a large private room in a bar, but Ask later converted it into a classroom for former gang members learning to read and write. With a blackboard and chalk hanging on the wall, it looked quite legitimate. Due to the potion in Sophie's body, she could not attend church school, and since Vianata was busy managing the company, she entrusted Sophie to Ask's care to attend classes with the former gang members. Immediately after Audrey arrived at Indo-Port, she performed the ritual to strip away Sophie's inner positive emotions. Just as Sun and others had predicted, after the positive emotions were stripped away, the cold-blooded characteristic inside Sophie was initially digested in just 3 days. She is now a Sequence 7 serial killer. It seems the Beander characteristic still had a considerable impact on this child. Ask said to Chesha, who resided within Sophie's body, while tidying up the teaching materials, his tone carrying a hint of reproach. He had been responsible for educating Sophie during this time, and the change in her mental state reminded him of the period when he was known as the Death Consul, thus causing him some slight dissatisfaction with Chesha. I wasn't the one who left the Beander characteristic inside her. Sophie blinked, and her eyes turned a bright blood red, a sign that Chesha's personality had surfaced. Besides, with the existence of Beander characteristics and the potion system, they are already much luckier than they were in my father's era. Chesha, who had automatically switched over, shrugged. You should be glad that I'm the one parasitizing her, not Mathafari or the creator's youngest son. Ask frowned, knowing that Chesha was speaking the truth, but still feeling a little put out. Let's not talk about that for now. If things don't work out, once you help me retrieve the Harbinger of Death, I will reconstruct my physical body and leave. Then you can help this girl transfer to the prisoner pathway. For a human, that sequence is sufficient. Chesha suggested. She originally didn't care about these matters, but since Ask was in charge now, she could only follow his lead. After all, role-playing the Sequence 4 demon of the demon pathway could also cause one to lose themselves, as evidenced by Agurito stirring up trouble at sea for so many years just to advance to Sequence 4. Chesha was trying to subtly tell Ask, if you don't want this girl to lose too much of her humanity, you can switch her to another pathway, but before that, could you please handle my affairs first? Ask naturally saw through Chesha's intentions. After pondering noncommittally for a moment, he said to Chesha, I told you that I would keep an eye out if the opportunity arose. Do you have any sensory feedback yourself? The Harbinger of Death was, after all, the tool Chesha had previously created to escape the control of the Mother Tree of Desire. There should be some subtle connection between them. Although it's very vague, I am certain that this opportunity is coming soon. Chesha stated confidently, I have been actively sensing the Harbinger of Death recently. If it weren't resisting me using Agurito's will, I could summon it myself. But now, even if the Harbinger of Death doesn't want to, Agurito shouldn't be able to hold back anymore, Chesha explained. As long as he can devour me, he will truly possess the rank to command the Harbinger of Death to a certain extent, allowing him to control it instead of being controlled by it. Even relying only on the weak connection between them, the Harbinger of Death finds it difficult to resist the commands of Chesha, its creator, and must rely on Agurito, the symbiont. However, this has also allowed Agurito to learn many things he didn't know before, including Chesha's current state. In the eyes of Agurito, who has already advanced to Sequence 4 Demon, this is an excellent opportunity. If he succeeds, he will no longer be dominated by the Harbinger of Death, making it worth risking everything. All right. Ask agreed simply, picked up the textbook, and walked out of the classroom. Sophie's eyes gradually turned dark red, and Chesha re-entered a state of slumber. East Balam, Elise. This is the logistics base for the Southern Continent Resistance, a port city located at the mouth of the Orinoco River. Because the main road from here to the East Balam front line, Paz Valley, passes through the rainforest, the resistance mainly relies on the galleons extorted from Intis and Fosak to transport their supplies to the front line via sea. It's quite similar to the strategic location of Indo-Port during the war. Standing on a distant hill overlooking the entire city, Adele remarked to Tracy, who stood beside her. Both were wearing brown and yellow tropical combat uniforms, carrying backpacks filled with food and tents, making them look convincingly like medical staff from the southern continent military. About 100 nautical miles from Indo Port, the Snow Wind docked, dropped off Adele and Tracy, and then turned back to strike any ships that might appear along the route. "Once you find the lion-headed serpent, we'll come back here and cause them some trouble," Tracy said, seemingly eager for chaos. "There are many pyramids left by the remnants of death nearby, and the lion-headed serpent often appears there." Adele noncommittally hummed and gazed at the distant city. Due to its important geographical location, Elise had been developed into a massive military fortress by the East Balam people. 7-meter-high city walls and layers of distributed fortress cannons declared to everyone that this was an absolute military exclusion zone. There should only be one demigod in this city, two at most, Adele calculated mentally. Although the Rose School of Thought incorporated some runaway members of the Life School of Thought, they were still fighting against two Orthodox God churches single-handedly, so manpower was inevitably insufficient. Because their pathway has the sequence 1 abomination Sueya, and the leader of the Temperance faction that Emlyn mentioned before, the sequence 2 ancient Bane Renik Tinakare, and the sequence 2 ancient Bane King of Curses Baranka, the Rose School of Thought doesn't actually have many saints, restricted by the law of Beander characteristic conservation. Jax, Zatwin, and the Silent One Mahams, these are almost all the saints the Rose School of Thought can deploy from its own pathway. Even if there are hidden saints, the number won't exceed this. Moreover, lacking clear records and witnessings, they must face the problem of lacking anchors, making it difficult to reach sequence 3. If one of us, Tracy or I, advanced to sequence 4, we might really be able to stir up some trouble in this city, even if they were only sequence 5 and sequence 6 now, causing trouble for the city's defenders was more than enough. After all, with Trasis' plague ability, it was perfectly suited for silently striking the enemy's rear defense line. Once news arrives that the Snow Wind has sunk supply ships along the coast, the Elise garrison is bound to fall into chaos. Sneaking in won't be difficult. If I go in with Tracy and spread some plague, this mission will essentially be complete, and it will be enough to secure Emlyn's position. Furthermore, unlike Indo, Elise has long been converted into a military fortress by the Rose School of Thought. It is almost entirely filled with combat and logistics personnel, civilians have mostly been relocated. Even if they released a plague, Adele wouldn't have any psychological burden. A non-lethal plague wouldn't kill them, but it would involve more people and force them out of combat status. At that point, the Eastern Theater of War could basically declare a phased victory. "Let's go." Adele drew the tactical knife from her waist, cut away the blocking vines, and walked down the hill with Tracy. Walking in the rainforest easily makes people feel irritable. The hot, humid air, the vines obstructing their steps, the hard-to-spot mosquitoes and leeches. Although a demoness's physique can prevent insect infestation, constantly having to clear a path is a psychological torment. "I can't believe I just went through a rainforest adventure on the underwater Bimini Island, and less than 2 months later, I have to delve into a surface rainforest again," Adele muttered inwardly as she bypassed 2 large trees that were strangely entangled ahead. The trunks of the 2 thick, tall trees were intertwined, their bark clearly scaled, pieced together densely, seeming ready to ride like 2 actual snakes wrapped around each other. "This is an important landmark. We are not far from our destination," Tracy explained. Many supernatural creatures were used during the construction of that pyramid. Their bodies were cemented into the foundation, which affected the surrounding vegetation. These snake-scale trees may have been growing for hundreds of years. "Seeing them means we are no more than 2 kilometers in a straight line from our destination." Adele nodded, feeling greatly relieved to finally be free from mechanical labor. As an assassin pathway Beander who craves adventure and challenge, she even felt that if she walked in the rainforest for a little longer, even monsters would start to look friendly, at least less boring and tedious than pioneering a path. Soon, the two arrived at a relatively open area again. The surrounding trees were withered, the weeds were dead, countless corpses protruded halfway from the soil, and faint shadows flickered in the deep gloom of the nearby woods. It seems that some remnants of the Death Pathway's Beander characteristic attracted the lion-headed serpent, which is the main material for the demoness pathway. Adele guessed secretly and believed this must be the correct answer. The lion-headed serpent is not easy to deal with. We should both attack together. Tracy said to Adele, "My potion material was hunted by Mother for me, so we have to figure out a different way for yours." As the name suggests, the lion-headed serpent is a Beyonder creature with the head of a lion and the body of a snake, except that unlike common multi-headed monsters, 3 snake bodies connect behind its head. Its signature ability is the plague halo that constantly surrounds it, which also involves some of the demoness's black magic abilities. It can easily use not only the deceleration and corrosion black magic that Adele often uses, but also higher-level instant death curses. Once injured during a fight with it, one immediately falls into a very passive situation. Beyonders like demonesses and magicians who can use substitutes can resist these curses to a certain extent, but they lack the means for an instant kill. If Tracy were a Sequence 5 Reaper of the Hunter pathway, it would be another matter, but now, the two can only hope that their first sneak attack succeeds. It would naturally be best if we could achieve a quick, fatal blow, but don't hold too much hope. It is a creature naturally capable of using substitutes. Tracy said, furthermore, its blood is one of the important products for setting up the Demoness of Affliction's advancement ritual. If we drag it out too long, we might lose a large portion of it. Adele nodded nervously. Although she was considered battle-hardened, this was her first time hunting for the potion materials she needed. The two swapped positions, with Tracy walking ahead to search for traces of the lion-headed serpent, and Adele following closely behind. Tracy moved slowly and lightly, carefully observing the surrounding environment, occasionally stopping in a spot to study an unclear mark for a long time. "You look like a real hunter." Adele couldn't help but admire. Tracy's actions showed that she was clearly not doing this for the first time. "I've been to many places with Irene before, and her pathway is really suitable for this kind of thing." Tracy did not look up, continuing to observe the scratch marks left on the tree root, her voice muffled. "Sigh, if you don't want to explain, you don't have to. There's no need to force conversation and remind yourself of past events." Adele didn't know what to say and could only follow silently behind Tracy. Finally, Tracy stood up and pointed to several marks on the ground, saying, "It's basically confirmed. A lion-headed serpent has been active here recently. Those are the unique marks left by its crawling. All we need to do now is hide here and ambush it when it appears." Tracy dusted off her hands. "We don't know how long we'll have to wait this time, so we can set up the tent first. You're here to ambush, and you're going to pitch a tent in its territory." Adele was highly skeptical, but she complied out of trust in Tracy. Soon, the two set up a triangular military tent and placed their sleeping bags side by side inside. Tracy then rummaged through her backpack and pulled out a wide cloak. Adele had seen this cloak before, on Bimini Island, when Katerina was attacking the barrier with all her might. Tracy had used this subspace-linked cloak to envelop them both. Tracy deftly crawled into the tent, opened the tent flap, and patted the empty space beside her, signaling Adele to come in. Then, she flipped the cloak up, and as it fell, the entire tent was covered and concealed. Chapter 352, Fleecing the Sheep. Thinking about it carefully, this was the first time she had been so close to Tracy. Adele adjusted her posture, sitting down in the tent with Tracy, observing the situation outside the cloak through a mirror. From the first time she met Tracy, the other party was a senior in the Demoness sect, a pirate general with a formidable reputation, seemingly exuding an aura that kept people at a respectful distance. Even after she discovered their connection through Gegran, she still couldn't be as natural with Tracy as she was with Vianata. Now, because the cloak wasn't large, they had to squeeze into the small tent. In the slightly chilly rainforest environment, Adele could even feel the heat emanating from Tracy. With just a slight shift of her gaze, Adele could see the wrinkles on Tracy's Lowen military training uniform, where her chest was pushed high. Even with conscious restraint, high-sequence demonesses would still exert a certain influence on intelligent creatures around them, regardless of the other party's sequence, gender, or even species. Even opponents in a life-and-death struggle would be uncontrollably provoked by Tracy's actions when conversing with her, let alone someone like Adele, who was relatively close to Tracy. The generally twisted personalities among demonesses might also be related to this characteristic. People who harbor goodwill towards them are easily affected by the demoness's traits, causing their emotions to become distorted, making it difficult for demonesses to have normal interpersonal relationships, thus becoming more self-centered and having more extreme and radical personalities. A fleeting thought passed, and Adele quickly composed herself. According to Tracy, they were staking out this time. If the lion-headed serpent didn't appear, they didn't know how long they would have to stay in this tent. If she didn't adjust her mindset, she would feel awkward. However, fortunately, the actual size of the subspace was not limited to the cloak. After waiting for a while, Adele and Tracy emerged from the tent and spoke to Tracy through a layer of canvas. It might take a long time. Let's take turns monitoring the mirror. I'll call you when the target appears. Tracy, aware of her own abilities, smiled at Adele. We'll switch in an hour. Adele nodded and sat down in the open space outside the tent. The scene inside the subspace looked no different from the outside, frozen at the moment the space unfolded, directly replicating a few square meters of scenery centered around the cloak. However, further away was pitch black, with no knowing what lay within. Try not to look too far. There's no clear boundary between the surrounding darkness and this replicated space. Tracy instructed, I told you once before, this subspace was created by a secret sorcerer. Its actual scope is much larger and has a certain corresponding relationship with our entire world. However, only this small area of space around us has a definite correspondence with reality. In other words, after I lift the cloak, only objects in this surrounding area will be returned to their original places, while objects that enter the darkness might appear anywhere in the real world, or, of course, in many places. Adele casually conjured an ice crystal and tossed it into the distant darkness. The ice crystal plunged into the darkness and disappeared without a trace. Finding that she indeed had nothing to do, Adele thought for a moment, then simply lowered her head and feigned sleep. Ever since she started working for Miss Audrey, she always carried at least one mystical item of the darkness pathway. Most of the side effects of these mystical items included drowsiness, causing her to constantly seek opportunities to catch up on sleep. In a daze, Adele recalled what happened in Backland before, when she was Altair Brewster, having passed a series of investigative missions without knowing the other party's purpose, with Baron Cinders being the final link in these missions. But why did Miss Justice kill Baron Cinders? Originally, Adele thought that this assassination was actually related to the Angel's fall in Backland, but later at the Tarot Club, she found that Miss Audrey had no prior knowledge of the Angel's fall, and naturally could not have made arrangements for it. Although Baron Cinders and Miss Audrey's father, Earl Hall, belonged to different factions, their statuses were completely unequal. Even if he had truly offended her, it was far from a point where Miss Audrey would need to resort to extreme measures. At that time, Miss Audrey's humanity still seemed very abundant, not like the effects caused by separating humanity, which meant she had made the judgment that it was necessary to kill Baron Cinders after careful consideration. What exactly was Baron Cinders involved in that made even Miss Audrey believe he had to die? Adele closed her eyes in thought. Besides Miss Audrey and herself, no one else was involved in this matter, and consulting other members of the Tarot Club was unlikely to yield an answer. Of course, Adele wasn't really trying to figure it out. After all, as the Tarot Club's member closest to an angel, Miss Justice had to contend with those ancient existences that had survived since the Second Epoch. She didn't even trust herself, let alone others. You have already left Backland. People must move forward, Adele admonished herself, again trying to clear her mind and drift into slumber. However, just as she was about to fall asleep, she heard Tracis' deliberately hushed, excited voice from inside the tent. Good luck, it appeared after only an hour. Upon hearing this, Adele dared not delay and quickly slipped back into the tent, looking at the mirror in front of Tracy. The mirror showed a limited space. Adele first saw a massive iron-gray lion's head with sharp canine teeth and manes nearly half a meter long standing on end, making the already disproportionate head appear even more grotesque. Its head's skin was iron-gray, similar to a zombie, faintly tinged with dark green, making it look less majestic like a lion and more eerie. Behind the lion's head, 3 snake tails, nearly half a meter thick, spread out, also iron-gray, covered with palm-sized hard scales. They slowly wriggled as the snake's body crawled, and the patterns on them opened and closed, making one feel a little dizzy. Including its raised lion's head, this monster stood over 1.5 meters tall. With its 3 broom-like tails spread out, its length probably reached 7 or 8 meters. What I need to remind you is that, despite its massive size, its blood content is pitifully small. Tracy explained to Adele while keeping an eye on the lion-headed serpent's movements. The outer layer of scales and skin grows directly on the bones, and there's a thick layer of exoskeleton underneath, with muscles and arteries encased in the middle. Do you notice its movements? It's not as flexible as a snake, but rather stiff, because its snake tails are actually made of segmented bone casings. Adele observed carefully and found that, just as Tracy said, the lion-headed serpent's movements were not flexible. Adele could even faintly hear the clicking sounds from inside its body as it crawled. Of course, this structure can reduce blood loss, but for a demoness without strong burst capabilities, this is also a bad thing. It's hard to break its defense with just one's Beyonder abilities. Tracy said, I told you all this once before I left the ship. You told me then that you had a solution. With that, Tracy stepped back, her meaning clear. You said you had a solution, right? Then you'll take the lead now. I do have a way. Adele nodded and asked Tracy, can this space isolate prayers? It can isolate them, but if you want to contact the outside world, it's not impossible. As long as I cast a simple mirror magic, I can establish a one-way mysticism channel between here and the outside world. Tracy affirmed, then considerately asked, do I need to step aside? It's not strictly necessary, but it would be best if you did, Adele said. Tracy agreed readily, drew the tactical knife from her waist, cut off a small strand of hair, burned it to ash with black fire, and smeared it on the mirror. The cut part quickly grew back, looking exactly as it was before. Just like when Tracy used magic mirror divination, the mirror surface quickly rippled like water, then concave inwards, its center growing darker and darker, seemingly spinning rapidly, making one feel a little dizzy. Then, she grabbed 2 more strands of hair, gently folded their ends, infused them with spirituality, and stuffed them into her ears. Finally, she turned her back and waved her hand, signaling Adele to begin. Seeing this, Adele no longer delayed and quickly closed her eyes, praying towards the mirror. Favored one of the sea and the spirit world, guardian of the Rorstad archipelago, dominator of underwater creatures, Great Calvetua. As a member of the Tarot Club, Adele naturally knew the relationship between the Church of the Sea God and the Church of the Fool, including the fact that the Pope of the Church of the Sea God, Alger Wilson, was actually Mr. Hanged Man, currently acting as the Sea God. The description of Adele guessing the real identities of Tarot Club members was mentioned before. Those who forgot can go back and check. And ever since Mr. Hanged Man advanced to Sequence 3, the range of his prayer response had become much wider. Even if he just stayed in Biome, his farthest response distance reached Toscat Island, a full several thousand nautical miles away. Of course, this was also due to the ocean he controlled during his advancement being the one with the lingering gray fog, granting him certain abilities that transcended spatial limitations. Additionally, Adele and he were both members of the Tarot Club, making their connection more apparent and easier for him to locate. After Adele learned about the characteristics of the lion-headed serpent from Tracy, her first reaction was to ask a big shot for help. Other monsters were fine, but this creature had an extremely poor compatibility with demonesses. Its abnormal resistance, exoskeleton, and substitutes, no less than a warrior's, were all the lion-headed serpent's fundamental means of survival. Coupled with its continuous plague effects, it became one of the most difficult mystical creatures to deal with at the Sequence 5 level. To solo this monster, even among Sequence 5, few could do it, except for a scribe who had recorded demigod abilities, a shepherd with an exceptionally good soul combination, or a guardian fully equipped with high-level mystical items. Originally, Adele wanted to ask Mr. Moon for some help, but he had not reached Sequence 3 and, unlike the previous Mr. Hanged Man, did not wield a sealed artifact equivalent to that level, making him unable to respond to prayers from a long distance. The same applied to Mr. Star, so she could only trouble Mr. Hanged Man, who had not yet returned to the northern continent. A few seconds after Adele finished her prayer, the mirror quickly returned to its original state, allowing Adele to see the outside scenery. Initially, there was no change. Then, the sky suddenly became overcast, and the light inside the rainforest instantly dimmed. Seemingly sensing the change in atmosphere, the lion-headed serpent restlessly raised its head and looked up at the sky. The next second, its massive head was illuminated by a bolt of lightning streaking across the sky. First, a restless azure blue orb of light appeared in the sky. After a brief pause, the orb shattered, rapidly elongated, and then plunged straight down at the lion-headed serpent on the ground with extreme speed, pinning its massive body to the ground before it could react. The lightning was absorbed by the earth the moment it touched the ground, but the ground at the center of the strike had already become scorched and cracked, and the heat generated even ignited several nearby trees. Fortunately, although most of the trees here were dead, they were also very scattered, and the fire showed no signs of spreading. As soon as the flames, which could not be extinguished immediately, spread, they were immediately doused by white foam stored in the nodes of other branches. This commotion is a bit too loud. Adele, while marveling at Sea King's ability once again, worried that such a large disturbance might attract the local demigods. Alger was, after all, exerting influence from a distance. If he attracted local demigods, such as Jax or Zatwin, she would be in trouble. The reason she initially preferred to find Emlyn, Mr. Moon, rather than Alger, with whom she had already cooperated remotely once, was precisely this. The abilities of the Moon Pathway were at least 8 streets ahead of Sea King's in terms of concealment. However, worrying was one thing, but watching the azure blue electric arcs crush the enemy indeed brought an indescribable thrill. With the lion-headed serpent's wails, its body quickly shattered and disappeared, reappearing more than 10 meters away. Of the 3 broom-like tails below its head, the left one was gone, leaving only a main trunk and the charred body on the right. Since the lion-headed serpent couldn't make its own wands, it could only use substitutes twice, which required consuming an entire snake body. Usually, when the lion-headed serpent used a substitute, it was when the plague it had spread took effect, allowing it to begin its counterattack. However, Sea King's attack was never just a single strike. Before the lion-headed serpent could react to where the attack came from, the second and third bolts of lightning struck down, each faster and fiercer than the last. After 2 muffled thunderclaps, the lion-headed serpent lay completely motionless on the ground. Chapter 353, The Birth of the Demoness of Catastrophe. It's resolved, just like that. Adele, hiding in the subspace, felt a sense of unreality, once again experiencing the overwhelming gap between a demigod and beyonders below Sequence 5. She patted Tracy, who was intentionally avoiding looking at the mirror, signaling that the matter was resolved, and Adele returned to the real world. The lion-headed serpent's corpse lay limp on the ground, its slimy scales charred by lightning, the patterns on them no longer discernible. Beneath the scales were sections of bone covered in a pale, greasy film. Though freshly dead, their color made them appear as if they had been dead for many years. The tubular bones were connected by keratin, and the muscles at the joints were still burning, which Adele casually extinguished. I didn't expect to cause such a commotion. It seems the tent was set up for nothing. Adele rummaged through her backpack and pulled out a material bottle pre-enchanted with black magic. This was a container demonesses specifically used to store biological materials. Although it looked only the size of a perfume bottle, its actual capacity was about 1 cubic meter, but it could only be used to store one type of biological material and nothing else. Extending the blade of her sleeve dagger, Adele easily dug a large chunk from the lightning-cracked exoskeleton, revealing the muscle fibers inside, which had been pulverized by the shockwave. Adele dabbed some blood with her blade onto the bottom of the material bottle, then infused spirituality into the bottle, aiming its opening at the excavated cavity. Subsequently, the blood and flesh mixture encased within the exoskeleton seemed to be pulled by a powerful suction, rushing into the bottle. However, only the blood ultimately entered the bottle, the remaining meat scraps piled up at the excavated opening like shriveled cotton wool. All right, that's done. Adele stood up, putting away the material bottle, while Tracy waved her hand, using silk threads to pull out the pegs securing the tent, quickly packing it up. Then, the two immediately and tacitly used silk threads to pull themselves through the trees, swiftly turning and fleeing. After witnessing the appearance of the lion-headed serpent firsthand, Adele immediately realized that with her collection of mystical items, it would be difficult to inflict effective damage. She had to ask Mr. Hanged Man for help. However, Mr. Hanged Man's abilities caused far too much commotion, to an extent that it was difficult to explain with normal natural phenomena. If there truly were demigods in Elise City, then they were probably already on their way. As expected, not long after Adele and Tracy left the forest, the area where the lion-headed serpent's corpse lay showed obvious anomalies. The rustling of leaves and branches could be heard thousands of meters away, as if all the inanimate objects in that area had come alive, reporting something to the approaching demigod. Just as I feared, Adele sighed, her mind already racing to think of countermeasures. It seemed the opposing demigod could directly reanimate the plants and trees in the surrounding environment to report what had happened in the area. Perhaps not the strongest type of demigod in combat, but certainly the most difficult for Adele and Tracy to deal with at the moment. Adele couldn't help but miss Furs, the magician of the Tarot Club. The traveler's ability was truly versatile, allowing for both offense and defense. Even a demigod would never be able to catch her. Thinking about it now is useless. First, recognize the situation. Adele made a quick estimation. It took the opponent about 5 minutes to reach their current location from Elise, starting from when the lightning struck. If the opponent's target was clear, it would take at most 2 minutes to close the distance between them. Tracy seemed to sense Adele's thoughts and replied directly, "If he's heading in the right direction, he'll catch up to us in 1 minute. Invisibility, then change direction." Adele quickly made a judgment. He can't keep awakening plants, and he's flying above the rainforest canopy, making it hard to sense us. The one guarding this place was either Jax or Zatwin. Not having reached the angel level, they couldn't turn the puppet's ability to manipulate inanimate objects into a passive one. They couldn't sustain such consumption. Moreover, the first awakening of plants had probably already allowed the pursuer to determine Adele and Tracis' sequence and pathway. There was no need to keep activating the plant awakening ability, which was quite a burden on spirituality, for investigation. Finally, seeing that level of lightning strike, he probably wouldn't dare to pursue too deeply. After all, he didn't know how many more lightning strikes Adele could summon. If he really wasted his spirituality on reconnaissance, he wouldn't be able to defeat Mr. Hanged Man, who might be hiding somewhere. He's also afraid. Understanding this, Adele immediately felt more confident. Zatwin was now like a minesweeper on a battlefield. Finding Adele and Tracy first would be his victory, and the longer he dragged it out, the more dangerous he would feel. Then let's take a gamble that the other party won't activate the awakening ability directly above us. Adele and Tracis' bodies quickly became transparent. They no longer used silk threads to move, dropping directly to the ground, eliminating their aura as much as possible, and instead walked towards Zatwin. When the two were almost about to intersect with Zatwin, Tracy directly pulled out a cloak and enveloped them both. This time, Tracy simply didn't use mirror magic to connect inside and out, because the Rose School of Thought demigods were highly sensitive to black magic, and peeking outside could very likely give Zatwin an opportunity. The two waited inside the cloak for nearly half a minute before cautiously leaving the subspace, though they still remained invisible. Zatwin seemed to have gone far away. The distant trees rustled, and the activated area appeared to be moving further away. Adele breathed a slight sigh of relief. Just as she was about to dispel her invisibility, she felt Tracy grab her wrist, seemingly reminding her. Adele paused, not immediately dispelling her invisibility to conserve spirituality. And during her hesitation, a figure suddenly emerged from the distant forest. He wore a black clerical robe, a black glove on his left hand. His face was gaunt, his skin brownish, and his eyes were sunken like a mummy's. His beard roots were black but turned white at the ends, extending from the corners of his mouth to his ears. However, they were not thick and quite short, appearing sparse. His eyes were close to his skin tone, a light brown. Despite possessing the demeanor of a priest, he gave off a sinister and terrifying impression, as if he might become deranged in silence. He was Zatwin, the Sequence 4 puppet, a demigod of the Indulgence faction of the Rose School of Thought. This cunning demigod hadn't truly left. He deliberately extended his reconnaissance range to ambush Adele and Tracy when they let their guard down, even using awakened creatures to scout far away while personally searching nearby. Cold sweat trickled down Adele's face. She stood rooted to the spot, not daring to move. She had underestimated the allure of herself and Tracy, two demonesses, to a member of the Indulgence faction. It was almost enough to make Zatwin risk being ambushed by the Sea King and linger in this rainforest for a while longer. However, Zatwin also had to divide his attention to manipulate the distant plants, which caused him to neglect his perception of the immediate vicinity. Relying solely on sight, he couldn't discover Adele and Tracy for a while. But Adele and Tracy absolutely couldn't retreat into space. They could only watch Zatwin wander around with a suspicious look, trying to sense any disturbance in the surroundings with his own perception. A few brief seconds felt like years to Adele. When she saw Zatwin walking step by step in her direction, she felt her heart was about to stop. However, just as Zatwin walked to about 50 meters from Adele and Tracy, the ground suddenly trembled strangely. A thunderous roar came from the sea tens of kilometers away, the sound of rock strata cracking, as if something was about to burst out from underground. I didn't pray to Mr. Hanged Man, and this sound is different from thunder. Adele was somewhat confused. She watched Zatwin's expression suddenly freeze, then he looked towards the distance in terror, seemingly detecting something terrifying through the revived plants. The next second, he jumped into the air without hesitation, his figure turning transparent, directly becoming an invisible phantom. He turned and fled without a second thought, even more decisively than when Adele and Tracy first saw him. What happened? Only after Zatwin had truly left did Adele cautiously move, climbing the tallest tree nearby and looking in the direction of the tremor. With just one glance, she was utterly terrified by the sight before her, almost falling from the treetop. The distant jungle had vanished, replaced by a conical volcano that had risen from the ground. Dozens of meters tall trees were flung into the air by this mountain that had ascended from the earth, like someone had knocked over a pen holder, spilling all the pens onto the ground with a clatter. Without warning, heavy snow began to fall from the sky, causing the temperature of this tropical rainforest to plummet. The sea at the edge of her vision became turbulent, seemingly approaching here step by step. Tsunamis, blizzards, earthquakes, various forms of calamity suddenly and spontaneously appeared in this area. Zatwin's figure looked like a kite with a broken string. He flailed for a short while in the storm of calamity before being swept into it, even his spirit body torn to shreds. Could it be? Adele suddenly became excited, seemingly understanding what was happening here, and her eyes welled up. What's going on? Tracy flashed to the treetop, saw the change in Adele's expression, and couldn't help but ask. If I'm not mistaken, Adele wiped her face haphazardly. Gegran, no, Mother is coming back. She succeeded. As Adele and Tracy spoke, the ground beneath their feet experienced its most intense tremor ever. Acrid, pale yellow steam erupted from the volcano, and the sound of cracking rock strata was deafening. Then, accompanied by an earth-shattering roar, rocks flew and tumbled, and incredibly hot magma, like ferocious fire dragons, spewed forth from underground, devouring everything in its path. And at the center of the volcano, Adele saw a shimmering human figure. Even though the distance between them far exceeded the effective field of vision, the figure's intense presence still made all living creatures within dozens of miles immediately aware of their existence. At the same time, a heavy emotion directly filled her mind, making her subconsciously fear the entity erupting from the volcano. This fear, reaching its extreme, transformed into a twisted worship. This is the demoness of catastrophe. Adele found her body stiffening, and then she laboriously looked at Tracy beside her, seeing her fingers slowly turning grayish-white, as if she was turning into marble or something similar. However, fortunately, she knew how to solve it. It was a name, and also an incantation, a revered name that Gegran had repeatedly emphasized must be kept firmly in mind. Before her thoughts completely solidified, Adele, with trembling lips, enunciated each word. New sprout of the calamity tree, symbol of destruction and new life, lord of plagues and calamity, the great media Gegran. Subsequently, Adele perceived in the ethereal that the shining figure turned towards her direction, and the next second, they were already standing in front of Adele and Tracy, with the petrification effect on both of them disappearing as well. Compared to a month ago, Gegran's appearance hadn't specifically changed, but in Adele's eyes, she looked even more striking than Katerina back then. Not only did she possess all the beauty of a woman at every stage, but due to the surge in her Beander status, she had gained an indescribable majesty. In her hand, she held something like a tattered cloth. From the black glove hanging from the drooping limb, it was clear that it was none other than Zatwin, the puppet, the demigod of the Rose School of Thought who had appeared earlier. Mother. Adele swallowed, bowing to Gegran, it seems you have succeeded. Indeed. Gegran smiled, and I feel my humanity has been preserved surprisingly well. That sounds like a good thing. Adele relaxed slightly and continued to converse with Gegran. However, there's also a bad side. Gegran's lips curved into an exaggerated, somewhat neurotic smile. She has awakened more within me. You must have felt her too, right? You mean those dreams? Adele suddenly understood, feeling that everything recently now made sense. Exactly. As the sequence of her Believerse increases, her influence on all Believers will also increase. Gegran nodded, still smiling, but in Adele's eyes, that smile held a strange sense of sadness. Who knows when I might become her, so, you must not forget my revered name. I still have exams tomorrow and the day after, but as promised before, there will be a week of explosive updates in mid-June, starting from the 13th when I finish my exams and return. There will be 2 updates a day, and I will notify you of the specific update times in advance. Here, I must apologize again for the chapters I made up last month. 354 Elaine. Chapter 354, Irene. After stabilizing her emotions slightly, Adele turned to Tracy. This is Gegran, you two haven't formally interacted in a long time. Aunt Gegran. Tracy finally looked up, her eyes filled with fear. After all, this was an existence of a higher sequence than her mother, Katerina. She had, not long ago, represented the demoness sect with Katerina in an attempt to capture Gegran. If Gegran wanted revenge, no one could save her. It seems you two are getting along well. Gegran, however, didn't mention the previous incident. Instead, she looked at the small bottle in Adele's hand, which contained the lion-headed serpent's blood, and spoke. After becoming an angel, many previous problems ceased to be problems. Even if there were conflicts and hatred, once one party completely transcended the human level, it no longer mattered. The conflict between the Essence faction and the True God faction. The Essence faction currently only consisted of Adele and Gegran. Who could the demoness sect target? Adele was overtly involved in the tripartite game of the 3 nations and held a position in the military. Due to Trasis matter, the relationship between the military and the demoness sect was already very tense. Moving against Adele would purely be asking for trouble. As for Gegran, an angelic sequence was enough to silence 80% of the demoness sect's methods. The demoness sect did have an angel, the current pope, the Queen of Nations, but with Cheek's existence above her, she could only advance to sequence 2. They were all sequence 2, so could she really defeat Gegran in a one-on-one battle? In the past, the demoness sect could have invited the primordial demoness to descend directly, relying on her sequence to forcibly suppress Gegran. However, too many people were now eyeing Cheek's position. Even the mad, primordial demoness, dared not make a big move at this time. If you dare to personally intervene and act against the Essence faction, you would risk a potentially higher level existence behind you digging up the primordial demoness's address in the astral world. If the primordial demoness, in her current state, were to be cornered by a true god, she might even fall. Therefore, Gegran was now completely unconcerned. I choose to forgive you, not because I lack the ability to retaliate, but because I can completely disregard you. Whatever you do no longer concerns me. Ignoring is the most severe form of contempt. Adele sighed silently. It seemed Tracy was in for a long period of psychological trauma. Gegran's successful advancement was a shot in the arm and a decisive move for both the current war situation and Adele's group, enough to completely change the balance of a war zone. Simply put, if Gegran joined the southern battlefield, after William Augustus of the Hand of Order tied up the abomination Sueya, the sequence 2 demoness of catastrophe would be enough to sweep across the entire southern continent. Even if all the remaining saints of the Rose School of Thought were bound together, they couldn't stop Gegran's advance. Not to mention the sequence suppression, Angels of the Hunter pathway and Demoness pathway are inherently designed for large-scale warfare. To rely on saint-level powerhouses with sealed artifacts to contend with angels of these 2 pathways. The Rose School of Thought probably wouldn't do such a foolish thing. Have you gathered all the main ingredients for your potion? Gegran then looked at Adele. Have you decided what direction of enhancement you want to choose? She had no intention of avoiding Tracy, even though this question almost explicitly told Tracy that Adele was a member of the Essence faction. As long as Tracy was rational, she should know which side to align with next. Not yet, Mother. Do you have any suggestions? Adele shook her head, then asked. This is a big matter for you personally. Just tell me after you've thought it through. Gegran's expression was relaxed. Over these past few centuries, I've already become intimately familiar with where all the Beyonder creatures on this continent are. Whatever you want to choose, I'll go and catch it for you. Gegran's expression was quite benevolent as she said these words, giving Adele a long-lost sense of déjà vu from her childhood with her mother. As for the sequence 4 Demoness of Despair Beander characteristic, I consumed an extra one when I took that sequence 2 Beander characteristic. I can actively separate it out based on my sequence. Gegran continued, she had switched to the Undying of the Death pathway at sequence 4, so she naturally didn't need this extra, Demoness of Despair. This portion of the Beander characteristic was not fully assimilated by Gegran. Instead, after digesting the sequence 2 Beander characteristic, it was forcibly contained by her own sequence, not affecting her mental state. This characteristic contains a very strong spiritual imprint. If I gave it to you, losing control would be inevitable. Gegran then looked at Tracy and explained faintly. After all, the safety of accommodating a Beander characteristic was inherently not comparable to consuming a potion. This Beander characteristic had also been consumed once by Gegran, a Beander who switched pathways in the Essence faction. If Tracy were to consume it, the risk of losing control would increase by at least 40%. Tracy opened her mouth, but in the end, she nodded, suppressing the disappointment that she couldn't help but show. She had been at sequence 5 for nearly 5 years now, digestion was long complete, and she was just waiting to get a potion or characteristic to advance. Being approached 3 times by the rising star, Klein had already made her feel very unbalanced. Now, Adele was also clearly catching up, which made Tracy feel a bit dazed, as if she was no longer keeping up with the times. The speed at which Klein advanced in the end was something even Katerina couldn't match, so Tracy could still comfort herself, but now, even Adele, whom she had always regarded as a younger sister, was about to catch up to Tracy, which inevitably made her feel a bit unbalanced. Gegran glanced at Tracy, said nothing more, and gently extended a hand, pulling forward to tear open a spirituality channel shimmering with strange light. After reaching the angelic rank, even if the abilities of one's own pathway did not include opening a door, one could still rely on one's connection with the spirit world for short-distance teleportation. This belonged to the reasonable application of one's own sequence and was not restricted by the type of potion. This was also the principle by which Sueya could support various battle zones in the southern continent from a long distance. Let's go back to Baron's Port first. Don't publicize what happened here for now, let them figure out what's going on themselves. Gegran did not directly destroy Elise City, because she knew that for both Adele and Tracy to advance to sequence 4, they needed to collect despair through a ritual. And a target that would allow Adele to collect despair with a clear conscience was truly not that easy to find. Adele and Tracy exchanged glances, then followed Gegran into the shimmering rift that had been torn open, leaving behind the primeval jungle, which was already nearly half destroyed. Indo Port, outside the headquarters building of Queen Island Shipping Company, Limited. It's almost time. Vianata pulled out her pocket watch for a glance, then cast her gaze towards the distant horizon. Although it was already February, it was still late winter in Fosak, and the temperature was very low, so she had a poorly knitted gray scarf wrapped around her neck. Not long after, in the setting sun, a slender sailing passenger ship appeared on the horizon, slowly approaching Indo Port. This was today's last passenger ship, the Spirituality, which departed from Tilith Port in Intis, transited through Indo Port, and finally headed to Loan. Starting tomorrow, Indo Port would once again resume shipping controls. The number of passenger ships would be reduced from the original 4 to 2. The freed ships would operate as cargo ships, relying on mining the minerals on Queen Island to maintain the company's operations. At present, Indo Port was a mixed bag, and continuing to let people in indiscriminately would obviously only stir up the situation. So Vianata, through the remaining influence of the Esco family in politics, quickly reached the decision to close the port. Soon, the Spirituality docked at the pier, lowered its iron gangplank, and waves of passengers disembarked from the ship, their expressions filled with fatigue and unease. They had just learned the news of the passenger ship restrictions, which meant that many of them would have to stay in Indo Port an extra amount of time until they secured new tickets. On the pier, company employees in black uniforms were holding promotional materials, explaining the necessity of the port closure to the confused and uneasy passengers, promising certain economic compensation, and prioritizing them for tickets on the next 2 ships. At the same time, another team held a different set of promotional materials, introducing simple Beyonder knowledge to the passengers at the pier, telling them that Beyonders were not scary, and calling on Beyonders to voluntarily report to the company to facilitate job arrangements. These matters had been gradually piloted since the Honeysuckle Empress left Indo port and the 7 sailing ships began operating. Now, they were simply being brought to the forefront after the Church of the God of War gave up its intervention. The only change was that the Church, in the original promotional materials call for Beyonders to cooperate with the Church was changed to Company. Among the crowd, there was a somewhat haggard young woman with red hair. She carried a brand new leather suitcase, her red hair coiled in loops behind her head. At this moment, she was listening with an incredulous expression to the company employee's announcement on the pier, her deliberately darkened eyebrows tightly furrowed. Is this not a new trap set by those people? Irene thought warily. In her opinion, the consequences of a wild Beyonder exposing their identity were not much better than death. What this company in Indo port was doing now was simply outrageous. Thinking this, she cautiously scanned her surroundings again, confirmed that no one was following her, then decisively turned and prepared to leave the pier. Walking on the recently paved flagstone road, Irene couldn't help but recall her escape from Tracis' hands earlier. After encountering that calm yet mad adventurer, she once thought she was finished. However, he merely asked Irene a few somewhat personal questions, then gave her new identification and a ship ticket to Tiana port. After a circuitous escape back to Intis, Irene spent a full 6 months adjusting her psychological state, directly abandoning the colonial route she had only taken once, and instead continued to trade along the coastal route of the Intersea West Coast, Fenaport, Intis. Her life slowly returned to normal. That period was not easy for her. Tracy often appeared in her dreams, only to quickly disappear, making it hard for her to distinguish if it was a good dream or a nightmare. The subsequent war also didn't affect Intis itself, it only impacted her business. But by living off her savings, she managed to maintain her dignity. This life continued until a month ago, when she saw the news of Tracis' death in the newspaper. Irene couldn't quite describe her feelings upon seeing that news. Although she had already made up her mind to leave Tracy, upon learning of Tracis' death, she remained dazed for a long time. It wasn't until 2 days ago that someone suddenly broke into her home and fired at her with a high-pressure steam rifle. At first, Irene thought this was Tracy faking her death to lull her into a false sense of security, then sending people to capture her. But when they engaged in combat, she realized the opponent had no intention of holding back, which didn't seem like Tracis' command, but rather an attempt to take her life. After a bitter struggle, Irene finally killed the attacker. When she tried to use her network to gather intelligence, she discovered that throughout Intis and even the entire continent's Beyonder market, extremely high prices were being offered for Beyonder characteristics of the hunter pathway. At this point, Irene could confirm that these people were definitely not sent by Tracy. Even the Vice Admiral of Disease couldn't have such a large budget. She tried to leverage her family's power, but sadly discovered that the family elder who had originally helped her escape from Tracis' hands, upon hearing that the price of her Beyonder characteristic now exceeded 3 times its purchase price, revealed an undisguised greed in his eyes. Her family had been severely hit during the embargo. A Sequence 7 pyromaniac Beyonder characteristic, under the high price acquisition of mysterious forces, could now fetch a high price of £7,000 in underground transactions, enough to revive a medium-sized noble family. Completely disappointed, Irene had no choice but to flee Intis, taking the last passenger ship to Fosak, hoping to transit from there and escape to Loan, to Ahahova, East Tucker, or Southwell. However, here, she was stopped by the embargo policy. How could she not be anxious? You need to calm down, Irene, don't get caught here. Irene told herself inwardly, her fingers under her winter coat nervously flexing and extending repeatedly. The short dagger hidden in her boot was digging uncomfortably into her. Thinking this, Irene quickly left the pier area, making several detours in between, trying to shake off any potential pursuers. After circling around, she also applied some simple makeup, and finally returned to the pier's hotel. A single room, Irene said to the clerk at the counter. 3rd room on the left on the 2nd floor. The clerk didn't even look up, tossing the key to Irene. Irene picked up her suitcase and walked up to the 2nd floor, unlocked the door with the key, and then froze in place. In the center of the room, Vianata was leisurely leaning back in a lounge chair, gesturing to her to sit opposite. "You really are cautious enough," Vianata said with a half smile, half sigh, truly a qualified meander. "However, if you had taken 2 fewer detours, I might not have been so certain of your identity. This is my first time meeting another hunter. Let's talk. At least I should make you understand our current situation." Chapter 355, Ashura Field. "Who are you?" Irene asked warily, not sitting down in front of Vianata, but instead taking a step back, ready to pull out the short knife she kept in her boot at any moment. "Let me introduce myself, my name is Vianata." Vianata paused halfway through, Vianata CC, and I am the current de facto administrator of Indoport. De facto administrator. Irene chewed on the weight of the words. "Do you mean the initiator of the Meander gathering?" "No, it's literal," Vianata replied. "You can think of this position as a combination of the former Archbishop of the Church of the God of War in Indoport and the Mayor." "I didn't realize you were such a big shot." Irene smiled faintly. "I find it hard to imagine a mayor or an archbishop personally tracking me. Today, I've really seen something rare. Yes, your luck is good. If your luck were a little worse, you might have seen the mayor laying flowers at your grave." Vianata wasn't angered by Irene's words and replied with an equally beaming smile. "Is that a threat, Ms. CC?" Irene asked cautiously. "No, it's just a reminder. I spent half an hour at the dock, and during that time, besides going in circles with you, I did quite a few other things." Vianata's expression turned cold. She pulled a blood-stained ring from her pocket, seemingly cut off along with a finger, and tossed it in front of Irene. "Cut from another group of people who were following you." Irene hesitated, then bent down to pick up the ring and examine it carefully. The pattern on the ring was a black and red double sword that Irene had never seen before. The base color was dull gray, made of cast iron, and brushed with a layer of rough sealing wax. "This ring is?" Irene asked carefully. "Iron and blood cross order." Vianata stared intently at Irene's face, seemingly trying to judge from her changing expression whether she was lying. "This is an Intis organization, and the large-scale hunting of Hunter Pathway Beyonders recently was initiated by them." At this point, Vianata gestured to Irene again. "Come in and talk. Close the door. What happens next shouldn't be known by unrelated people." Irene hesitated for a moment, but ultimately trusted Vianata, gently closed the door, and then sat down in the chair in front of Vianata. "Speaking of which, you still haven't told me your name." Vianata looked at Irene with a half smile. "What should I call you?" "Claire, that's my surname." Irene briefly hesitated but still gave the pseudonym she had been using. After all, it was still uncertain if the other party wouldn't target her. "All right, Miss Irene." Vianata revealed an "I knew it" smile. "Actually, I just wanted to see if you would give your real name." "You've seen me." Her pseudonym exposed on the spot, Irene was a little embarrassed and asked with a slight blush. "No, I haven't. I guessed it." Vianata showed a smug smile. "But now I can confirm it, saving me the trouble of finding someone else to verify." It wasn't that Irene was careless. Even if she had truly reacted, the subtle changes in her expression when her real name was suddenly brought up still couldn't have escaped Vianata, who had already advanced to sequence 6. Conspirers have unique bonuses in bluffing and discerning others' bluffs. Such micro-expressions cannot escape their eyes. "Where did you hear my name?" Realizing her disguise was exposed, Irene simply gave up and directly asked Vianata. "Although I haven't spent much time at sea, rumors involving pirate generals, especially female pirate generals, tend to spread much faster at sea than you might imagine." Vianata shrugged, picked up the patterned teapot on the table, and poured Irene a cup of hot tea. The amount of tea leaves wasn't much, and the color was pale. "We might be talking for a long time, so have something warm to drink first." Vianata pushed the white porcelain teacup towards Irene. The tea in the cup dangerously swayed, almost spilling out. "Before we get to business, do you have anything else you want to ask?" Watching Irene take the teacup and gently blow on it, Vianata asked abruptly, "For example, about Tracy." Irene's hand, holding the teacup, trembled slightly. The teacup and the saucer beneath it clinked, making a clicking sound. "She has passed away." Irene took a deep breath, as if that would give her more confidence to speak, so her voice wouldn't tremble. Your news at sea seems a bit out of date. Vianata didn't explain further, reaching for the Southern Continent News on a nearby shelf. This was a newspaper she had specifically ordered an extra copy of after learning of Adele's unexpected arrival in the Southern Continent. She grabbed the latest issue, flipped to the front page, and handed it to Irene. Irene took it doubtfully and immediately saw the ironclad ship on the front page of the newspaper, as well as the 3 flags flying on the ironclad ship. One was the golden-edged honeysuckle, like the Queen Island Company, one was the royal sword of judgment, and the third was the black skull symbol she had once been so familiar with, the former flag of the Black Death. The headline on the front page boldly read, "Exceptional Promotion. Pirate General Tracy who abandoned darkness for light." Irene eagerly looked down and saw the following written. Not long ago, Vice Admiral of Disease, Tracy, one of the 4 kings and 7 generals, lost her fleet in a pirate infighting and ultimately chose to surrender to the kingdom. She was exceptionally promoted to Navy Lieutenant by Vice Admiral Emmeline White of the Southern Theater and put in charge of the kingdom's privateering fleet in the Southern Theater. So, she's not dead. Irene finished reading the newspaper, and for a moment, she didn't know what expression to show, unsure whether to be happy or afraid. Of course, demonesses don't die that easily. Vianata adjusted her posture to sit more comfortably. She'll probably be back in a few months. Back? Back where? Indo-Port? Irene asked subconsciously. Of course, the ironclad ship she's using now is the company's property, Vianata replied as a matter of course. Even if she doesn't want to come back, she'll have to return the ship once the battle in the Southern Continent is over. Your company, what's your relationship with Tracy? Irene asked hesitantly. She began to wonder what background this company had. Vianata not only claimed to be the actual power holder of Indo-Port but also spoke of her relationship with Tracy without reservation, which made Irene increasingly feel like she had stumbled into something extraordinary. You must remember Anne, Tracis' ship doctor, right? She's currently in Indo-Port as Tracis' representative. If you insist, it's like she's invested. Vianata did not directly answer Irene's question. If you accidentally get injured while staying in Indo-Port, you'll see her. Of course, if you want to see her, I can take you to her. No, never mind, she doesn't like me. Irene quickly waved her hand, smiling bitterly. I tried to escape from Tracy several times before, causing her a lot of trouble. Honestly, if you had really escaped the first time, Anne's attitude towards you might have been better. Vianata pouted, feeling a sense of injustice for Anne. Putting herself in Anne's shoes, Tracy didn't like herself, but preferred a kidnapped Irene, and this Irene always wanted to escape. After each failed escape, Tracy not only didn't blame her but also made Anne treat her wounds. If it were the short-tempered Vianata, she would have already erupted. It's a wonder Anne could endure it. If you don't want to meet her, I won't tell her you're here, but you can't leave here. You need to ensure I can find you whenever I want. No longer thinking about Anne, Vianata directly spoke to Irene, who seemed to be drifting into memories. As for the reason, I will explain it to you next. The Iron and Blood Cross Order is currently collecting a large number of Hunter Pathway Beander characteristics for some purpose. The Knowledge Church is trying to instigate a riot, adding fuel to the chaos here. Both Loan and Intis forces are trying to profit from this without taking responsibility, while the Church of the God of War wants to let it run its course and get rid of this hot potato. Vianata spoke in one breath, ignoring Irene's stunned expression. Finally, this city is now in our hands, temporarily. Vianata spread her arms and gently waved towards the window. Irene was dizzy from the flood of information and wanted to ask more questions, but reason stopped her in time. She quickly realized that knowing too much might not be a good thing. Then, what do you need me to do? Irene took a deep breath and asked Vianata. She was now alone, and bounties for Hunter Pathway Beyonders seemed to be posted all over the continent. Even if this woman in front of her had some connection with Tracy, which might lead her back to her old life, Irene now had no better option. Someone will come to find you soon, and he will arrange work for you. Vianata stood up. We are very short-handed right now and dare not casually employ Beyonders of unknown origin, but you are different. We at least know something about you, and you have no reason to harm Tracy, do you? Are you that sure? Although she already had the answer in her heart, Out of the unique contrarian psychology of a hunter pathway sequence 8 and above, Irene still asked, after all, in Sea Legends, I was a noble young lady kidnapped by Tracy. There's still a motive for revenge against Tracy, isn't there? If you wanted to do that, you could have ambushed her with the Intis military attaché when Tracy was searching the world for you, and then tearfully claimed her bounty. Vianata pouted. Also, unnecessary provocation is usually only used on people you are close to. You and I are not familiar, so this kind of probing is meaningless. Irene was once again left speechless by Vianata and could only nod awkwardly, watching Vianata unhurriedly pack her things, open the door, and leave. After Vianata left, Irene gently pulled up her sleeve, looking at the exquisitely crafted diamond bracelet on her wrist, remaining silent for a long time until the sun completely set below the horizon before she collected her thoughts. Vianata left the room, walked through the long corridor, turned a corner at the landscape painting hanging at the end, and saw Anne, dressed in a black maid uniform and white apron, leaning against the corridor. Upon seeing Vianata emerge, she snorted as a greeting. If you want to know what's going on, you'd better ask proactively, otherwise, I have no intention of sharing information voluntarily. Vianata said somewhat impatiently, seeing Anne's hesitant expression. Although Vianata spoke eloquently when bluffing Irene, that was actually to conceal the fact that she hadn't discovered Irene herself. No matter how strong a hunter's tracking ability, it would be unrealistic to find Irene in a crowd at the dock based only on a verbal description. Only an old rival like Anne, who had a deep impression of Irene, could have done that. Anne glared at Vianata and said emotionlessly, what was her reaction? She probably still has feelings for your captain. That momentary daze when she heard Tracy wasn't dead wasn't fake. Vianata recalled Irene's reaction, but she feels she's caused you a lot of trouble and is a bit afraid to see you. Good that she knows. Anne said bitterly, if I had really hardened my heart and put some poison in her wound medicine back then, none of this would be happening now. If it weren't for the captain, I'd be going to find her with a shotgun tonight. Vianata pouted, not worried that Anne would actually do anything, or rather, precisely because she wouldn't do anything, Vianata was worried about Anne's state. Are you all right? Vianata reached into Anne's apron pocket and pulled out a pewter flask. She shook it twice and found there was still a little liquor inside. What's in it? Nothing. Anne's voice sounded muffled, the flask contains nippos. Do you want some? Still saying, nothing. Vianata smiled wryly. Nippos, rumored to be able to light a match on its surface, wasn't something everyone in Fosak could drink, let alone Anne, who was originally from Feniport and had a moderate alcohol tolerance. All right, hurry back to your room and stay there. Vianata pushed Anne. Although it sounds a bit strange to say this, I still support you, provided you don't sink her to the bottom of the sea. Anne looked at Vianata in surprise, then nodded heavily after a few seconds, her lips trembling slightly, seemingly saying something. Vianata vaguely heard a, thank you. Is this the Shira field, mentioned in Emperor Rosal's novels? Vianata sighed in her heart, only hoping Adele would return soon so she wouldn't have to get entangled with these people. Starting today, there will be 2 updates daily, expected to last for a week. The time for the first update is uncertain, the second update will still be at midnight. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. And please support the author by link in description. Chapter 356, Playing Along. After sending Anne back to her room, Vianata sought out Audrey once more. It was already 7 in the evening, Fosak time. The number of people protesting in the streets had already decreased over the past 2 days, and now the streets were utterly silent, with only a few carriages seen soliciting passengers. When Vianata arrived at Audrey's room, Audrey was standing by the window, gazing at the deserted street, lost in thought. The lights of the port reflected in the windowpane before her. You're here. Audrey turned around, a gentle smile on her face. Have you finished investigating the Beyonder intelligence among the passengers who arrived at the port today? Yes, among the passengers who arrived today, 2 were confirmed Beyonders and have completed their registration with us. 5 were suspected Beyonders, and 1 was shot dead on the spot for murder. I handled it personally, without causing a commotion. Vianata reported everything in meticulous detail, not forgetting to add a final remark. Quote. Although I've asked before, are you sure you only need to stay here? In reality, this room looked completely out of place with Audrey's style. Regardless of Audrey's strength, her appearance alone certainly merited the description of being as gentle as jade, making people unwilling to see her suffer. Yet, the room she chose was in the headquarters building, close to the boiler room. Exposed iron pipes ran along the walls, spewing high-temperature steam or condensate. The interior facilities of the room were surprisingly simple: concrete floors, walls covered with winding copper and iron pipes, and sparse furnishings. A black iron frame bed, a white porcelain washbasin, a workbench facing the French window covered with notes and memos, and a coat rack in the corner with two identical blue cloaks hanging on it, next to a full-length mirror. In a sheltered corner by the wall, there was a brass bell and a bell rope. Miss Audrey's 3 meals a day were delivered by pulling the bell, and the brass bell in her room was directly connected to Vianata's room. Once the bell rang, it meant the situation had become serious, and Audrey had to leave immediately to resolve the problem. Thousands of colorful sticky notes covered the walls, making anyone inside feel as if they had stumbled into a garden. These colorful notes fluttered slightly in the gas leaking from the pipes, like butterflies spreading their wings. Vianata had heard from Adele, who once infiltrated aristocratic circles disguised as a personal valet, about the lives of nobles. Most of them lived in extreme luxury, valuing ostentation, and couldn't even wear the same clothes for 2 consecutive days, or they would be ridiculed. And this young lady, once a noble among nobles, the youngest daughter of Earl Hall, was known as Backland's most dazzling gem. In her Backland mansion, she had several wardrobes just for evening gowns. Furthermore, she was not just a noble but also a prominent figure in the mysterious world, a member of the Divine Council, a true demigod. When Vianata first learned she would be hosting this important figure, she was quite apprehensive, fearing she might do something wrong. As it turned out, after touring the Queen Island Shipping Company building, this young lady immediately took a liking to this room and moved in directly, without a single complaint. She had been living here, contemplating the information-filled sticky notes on the walls between the pipes. She was the brain of the entire Queen Island Shipping Company, and even the entire Tarot Club. The pipes and bell ropes on the wall formed a nervous system, combining to create a living entity. The only incongruous item in this small room was a luxurious dog bed, handmade from wooden planks with polished brass for the entrance barrier, and thick velvet cushions inside. The large dog named Susie lay within, wagging her tail in a friendly manner upon seeing Vianata enter. "It's all right." Audrey shook her head, her smile serene. "As I told you, I'm hiding here to minimize my presence as much as possible and avoid interfering with reality. Besides, I'm not as unaccustomed to the lives of ordinary people now. The lives of nobles were not as wonderful as imagined. There were many nobles, even more people who wanted to become nobles, and still more who didn't want others to become nobles. Those seemingly extravagant customs were actually backed by lessons learned in blood. Not being able to eat the same dish twice was to prevent targeted poisoning. Not being able to wear the same clothes continuously was to guard against assassination. Frequently changing residences was to guard against rebellion. Regularly hunting to ensure one's physical condition was also the same. Ordinary people might find it incomprehensible, but few ordinary people were born with the risk of assassination. Recalling her thoughts, Audrey refocused on the task at hand. Based on the intelligence in her mind, she quickly recalled the number of Beyonders currently under surveillance. The notes on the wall were merely for show, all important information was in her mind. Are we starting to run short of manpower? Audrey looked at Vianata with an inquiring gaze, and the other party nodded in affirmation. The Church of the God of War retreated quite decisively, without any lingering. They discarded sealed artifacts they could, at least taking away those high-level sealed artifacts above level 2. A large number of level 3 sealed artifacts, which wouldn't cause significant harm but were sufficiently bizarre, difficult to seal, and prone to causing commotion, were left in the church's basement. This was euphemistically called mystical aid, but in reality, it was to further drain the human resources of the port occupiers. Once their Beyonders were completely tied up, a swift and decisive strike likely awaited them. First, confirm with each of those willing to cooperate if they are willing to temporarily guard the door of the underground sealed artifact room. Audrey quickly made arrangements. This position can be jointly handled by Beyonders and ordinary police, and the proportion of Beyonders can be appropriately reduced. Alright, I'll discuss the specific details with Anne before making a decision. Vianata nodded. During this time, Audrey had been deliberately giving her opportunities to make these decisions, which greatly helped her digest the Conspirer potion. Vianata was very confused by this, because in her opinion, she had only done some very simple things, or rather, merely concretized and supplemented Audrey's thoughts. Audrey's answer was that she was already at the center of a huge conspiracy vortex, so no matter what she did, she was participating in this conspiracy. Once everything came to light, her potion would likely be fully digested. Hold on for a while, new forces will join soon. Audrey didn't explain much, merely offering Vianata a vague reassurance or two, telling her to go back and rest early, as there was still work to be done tomorrow. After sending Vianata away, Audrey took out her spirituality materials and quickly set up the ritual to summon a messenger. I summon in my name, the invisible creature roaming the upper realm, the strange spirituality friendly to humans, the messenger unique to Bernadette Gustave. This messenger's summoning method was provided by Miss Hermit, leading to her mother, Queen Mystic Bernadette, who was now a Sequence 2 sage. The invisible messenger quickly appeared. Audrey glanced in the direction of its appearance, her pupils suddenly turning into vertical spindle shapes, her eyes looking like a true giant dragon. A dream was directly loaded into the messenger's mind. Bernadette could directly read the information she stored in the dream when she retrieved the messenger. In the dream, Audrey requested Bernadette Gustave to help her contact King of the Five Seas Nast Solomon, to express her willingness to cooperate with him. She believed that with the combined suppression of King of the Five Seas, the most senior among the four kings, and Queen Mystic, they should be able to resolve the problem in Indo-Port. Although the Tarot Club's Holy Scripture recorded the 6 angels beside Mr. Fool, Audrey didn't think she could move them. Firstly, for angels like the Angel of Death and the Angel of Redemption, whose descriptions in the Holy Scripture were vague, Audrey had no idea how to contact them. Secondly, although the Angel of Mercury had some connection with the Tarot Club, there was also a Snake of Fate Ouroboros on the other side. Before the other party made a move, she couldn't use her trump card first. The Angel of Life was suspected to be Mr. Sparrow's messenger, and the Angel of Punishment was likely Mr. World himself. One was busy fighting the Rose School of Thought, and the other was still sleeping, unable to help. As for the Angel of Time, Audrey naturally skipped over this part, knowing it was unreliable. Now was the time to compete with trump cards, to see who would crack first. No matter what, she had to stabilize this situation first. Audrey's eyes gradually deepened. Nast Solomon was, after all, a descendant of a hereditary noble ennobled by Emperor Rosal. From the pirate convention he formulated, it could be seen that he was a fellow who liked order. At least, among the forces with no clear background currently, he was the most wavering in his stance. Using him to counterbalance the undying king would be just right. The worst outcome would only be for Indo-Port to become a pirate haven like Byam. As long as the two tragedies of Backland were not repeated, all of this would be worth it. Audrey gently sat down in her chair, looking at the room already covered with various sticky notes. Countless slips of paper filled with information formed a giant cocoon, enveloping her in the middle. Even though she knew that as a demigod, she didn't need these emotions, she still sat in this suffocating room, writing and drawing until late into the night. All the sticky notes suddenly spontaneously combusted into ashes, and only then did she change her clothes and fall into a deep sleep on the iron frame bed. Adele opened her eyes and found herself once again in that burning city. The only difference was that the sky here was even darker this time. If the previous color was flowing blood, now it was congealed blood clots. It seems all of this is a dream, Adele told herself. She hadn't boarded the island with Tracy, hadn't met Gegran, and was still worried about finding the lion-headed serpent. Unbeknownst to her, she had fallen asleep. Feeling a bit melancholic, Adele was about to stand up and continue exploring when a familiar female voice unexpectedly came from beside her. "You finally came in. I've been waiting for you here for a long time." Adele jolted and quickly looked in the direction of the voice, finding Gegran standing beside her. She was no longer wearing the white silk robe she had on when she first appeared, but had changed into a brightly colored silk kippah. The lipstick on her lips was like a fiery flame, mixed with fine gold powder. It was said that this garment was invented by Emperor Rosal and was only sold in some former Intis colonies on the southern continent. Her long hair was pure black, and her fair skin, acquired after becoming an angel, seemed to glow with a crystalline light. Her entire being exuded a strong feminine charm. She wore a pair of pointed, slender white high heels, and her long, jade-like legs were subtly revealed as she walked. Her unique scent tantalized Adele's nerves. So, this isn't a dream, Adele muttered, testingly clenching her hand, finding her movements normal. Her memories from before falling asleep clearly resurfaced in Adele's mind. She remembered that she, Tracy, and Gegran had traveled through the spirit world to Baron's Port, first finding a place to get Gegran new clothes to replace the robe woven from Demoness's silk she had worn when emerging from underground, then finding an inn to rest, planning to secretly rendezvous with the Snow Wind at the port the next day. At this moment, Adele felt her hand being held, then guided by Gegran to her chest. Beneath the soft touch was a pounding heartbeat. That dreamy, unreal feeling was instantly shattered by the throb of life, bringing Adele back to her senses. This is certainly a dream, but I am real, and you are real. Gegran's voice carried an unchanging languor, making those who heard it feel warm and tingly inside, as if bathed in the afternoon sun, almost drowning in it. Now, come with me. Let's go together and see what the deepest part of this city looks like. Gegran extended her hand to Adele. How far did you get before? Under that beech tree, Adele replied truthfully, pointing to the towering beech tree. She wasn't sure if it was her imagination, but there seemed to be fewer corpses on it, and they didn't turn their bodies to follow Adele's gaze. All right, then we'll go look under that beech tree. Gegran nodded, took Adele's hand, and walked deeper into the city. Dividing line. Second update today, asking for monthly votes and recommendation votes. Although this book is almost 1,000,000 words now, the effect of monthly and recommendation votes is not as significant as before, but seeing this data is still a bit awkward. Also, I hope everyone doesn't stop following the subscriptions during this period of burst updates. Burst updates can potentially affect the average subscription. This book of mine only reached 500 subscriptions per chapter almost 100 chapters ago. If a burst of updates drops the average subscription below 500, it would be awkward. Chapter 357, I Refuse. The surrounding scenery rapidly receded as Gegran led Adele to fly towards the beech tree. This beech tree seemed even larger than last time. Originally just a tree in the city center, it had now split the city into two sections. Its branches were still adorned with hanging corpses, and Adele and Gegran flew between them. Several times, Adele felt as if those corpses wanted to turn and grab her clothes, but due to Gegran's presence, they dared not move. These are all believers of the City of Calamity, but you probably guessed that already. Gegran didn't deliberately drive away the corpses, her mere presence caused them to automatically retreat. The corpses were entangled by branches, suspended amidst countless jagged, bizarre buildings. The closer they got to the beech tree, the more bizarre the city's architecture became, with towering walls, fortresses, and spires, staggered like a labyrinth. Buildings in the shapes of cylinders, cones, cubes, spheres, and other geometric forms were stacked in clusters, inverted and distorted. And amidst these chaotic structures, tubular sky bridges seemed to connect them, casting an indelible shadow over Adele's heart. But didn't you say before that there were only 3 believers of the City of Calamity? Adele asked, puzzled. Besides me, you, and the primordial demoness, there are many others here. There are only 3 on the northern and southern continents. Gegran explained, on the other side of the seal, there's a west continent, where many Sephira are sealed, and the main body of the City of Calamity is also there. There are also many residents there who have mastered another system of Beyonder power. They don't rely on Beyonder characteristics but gain abilities through a ritual-like arrangement. The ritual you performed when you advanced to Sequence 7 originated from the West Continent. It was modified based on common mysticism rituals on the Northern Continent, but its effectiveness is the same. Residents of the West Continent also worship the City of Calamity. Adele asked in surprise, so, there's also a Church of the City of Calamity there? Strictly speaking, they don't worship the City of Calamity itself, but rather its various branches. Gegran replied, according to the information I've gathered from this dream, some of them believe in beings called Chongshan. Different Chongshan control different types of calamity. The people there collectively refer to these beings as Chongshan, and out of fear of disaster, they in turn worship them. This act of categorization, in turn, facilitated the awakening of the overall consciousness of the City of Calamity. As they spoke, Gegran and Adele had already arrived at the foot of the beech tree that split the entire city in half. The flames on the beech tree seemed to have burned for tens of thousands of years, yet the great tree still stood, seemingly holding unique significance for believers on both sides. Gegran gently tapped the thick trunk with her hand, and the bark ignited, producing purple flames that formed an illusory light door. Adele also tried tapping it, but there was no reaction. Only those at the demigod level can open the light door. To pass through the light door to the other side of the city, you must wait until you advance to an angel. And after advancing to a true god, perhaps there will be new changes here. Gegran explained, so, if you want to borrow more of the Saphira's power, advance your sequence as quickly as possible. I can also borrow the Saphira's power. Adele's eyes lit up, immediately noticing the implied meaning in Gegran's words. At your level, there isn't much power you can borrow. For a demoness, its greatest use is that any ritual requiring the witnessing of a true god or other high-level existence can have its power source directed to the City of Calamity. From then on, your destiny will be intertwined with the City of Calamity, and others attempting to divine you might be interfered with by the City of Calamity. Gegran patiently explained to Adele, however, being too entangled with the Saphira's destiny isn't necessarily a good thing. You need to weigh the pros and cons yourself. Adele stroked her chin, deep in thought. Is this an ability possessed by all demonesses who control the City of Calamity? Gegran let out a soft hum, not answering immediately, but instead turned her gaze towards the light door. On the other side of the light door, a deep, dark passage appeared, its sides covered with ugly and distorted sculptures, seemingly the result of secondary carving, as if a desecration of this ancient city. In the burning purple flames, Adele saw that the passage was strewn with corpses from unknown eras, each having suffered varying degrees of pounding, squeezing, twisting, and tearing. Under the dim light, the gigantic figure at the end of the passage, merely revealing half its outline, almost caused Adele's sanity to crumble. That was the ultimate incarnation of the forbidden entity the Tarot Club had repeatedly warned against approaching, the source of cosmos contamination, the core of all calamity in the world. Like a speeding steam train, a massive black front surged forward along the passage, crushing the ancient remains in its path, rolling at high speed, tightly pressed against the 10-meter-high inner wall of the passage. Adele felt her body disintegrating and deforming. At the same time, she noticed that even Gegran beside her was not spared. Countless greenish-black small snakes peeled off her face and died, their shed skin bearing human-like patterns. In the last instant before Adele's consciousness faded, she clearly saw what was assaulting them from the end of the passage. It was a swirling, surging mass of blood-red mist, an amorphous substance like blood foam spewing from a throat, and its tunnel-filling front was densely covered with constantly forming and decomposing eyes. It is different from other Saphira, we cannot control it. Gegran's body also disintegrated and festered when facing that existence, yet her voice still echoed through the city. All we can do is prevent it from controlling us. Adele suddenly woke up from her dream, drenched in cold sweat that soaked her pajamas. Tracy lay on the adjacent bed, her sleeping face peaceful, pressed tightly against the wall, looking more like a child lacking security than a renowned pirate general. The experiences from the dream flooded her mind, fragmented memories causing her head to throb. Scarlet restraint, primal jelly, colors beyond space, burning beech trees, the door to the West Continent, many phrases, even when Adele recalled them, she didn't know what they meant. The protection of knowledge from the outer deity in her mind was still at work, preventing her from being contaminated by such information. Throwing off the covers, Adele was now wide awake, and could only shakily get out of bed to pour herself a glass of water from the kettle on the table. A large glass of cool boiled water flowed down her throat into her esophagus. Only then did Adele feel her mind clear slightly, no longer in chaos. It was then that she remembered why Tracy was in the same room as her. When they returned to Baron's Port with Gegran, Adele and her group found a random inn to stay at. Gegran chose a single room, right next to Adele's. Should I go see Gegran? Adele was somewhat hesitant. What she saw tonight gave her an unprecedented sense of unease. Even though she had repeatedly died unnatural deaths in dreams before, and some involved seeing the deaths of mythological creatures, what she saw today was something beyond all that. Although Adele hadn't made up her mind, she wasn't slow in her actions and had already put on her clothes. Even though dying in dreams previously didn't affect reality, she had never seen anything so terrifying before. Even Emperor Rosal was corrupted, and the Black Emperor's resurrection couldn't rule out this contamination. I should talk to someone. Adele tiptoed out of the room, came to Gegran's door, and knocked. The door slid open naturally. Gegran was half reclining on the bed, a red candle flickering at the head of the bed, its warm light making her face alternately bright and dim. What exactly did I see? Adele asked hesitantly. The City of Calamity. Gegran pulled the quilt beside her, making space for Adele. To be precise, the end of the City of Calamity. Adele carefully sat beside Gegran, leaning on her shoulder. That fool controls Saphira Castle, and became the Lord of the Mysteries. The Creator's eldest son controls the Chaos Sea, and is plotting to become God Almighty. But no one can control the City of Calamity. Gegran said slowly, her expression solemn. The City of Calamity is such a special existence, and this is also why Cheek fears it. Do you remember when I told you before that the primordial demoness could resurrect like the Black Emperor? That statement isn't entirely accurate. After the Black Emperor dies, if the order he established still remains, he can mysteriously resurrect from his mausoleum. The primordial demoness, however, will be reincarnated in the body of a demigod-level demoness or above after a sufficiently large calamity occurs. But, after the Black Emperor's resurrection, if his 3 Sequence 1 Beander characteristics were occupied during that period, those 3 Sequence 1 Beander characteristics would automatically return. Whereas after the primordial demoness's resurrection, the existence occupying her Sequence 1 will not be affected and can still retain the Beander characteristic. This. Adele instinctively frowned, finding it unbelievable. Due to the law of conservation of Beander characteristics, the resurrection of an old god must be accompanied by the return of their characteristics, otherwise, their status and abilities cannot be maintained. No, there should be another possibility. Adele looked at Gegran, who nodded. The only explanation is that the one resurrected is not the original primordial demoness, but rather, a Chongshan, or one of the incarnations of the City of Calamity. Gegran said gravely, if a primordial demoness falls, a new primordial must immediately take her place, otherwise, the City of Calamity will further awaken and gain power equivalent to a true god through rituals with the Saphira. You said before that you were killed by a demigod-level existence in the dream. That was once the vessel that the City of Calamity had taken, but at that time, its power was still very weak, allowing Cheek to become the primordial demoness first, actively severing her connection with the City of Calamity. Although I want to bring Cheek down, that doesn't mean I wish for the City of Calamity to awaken. Gegran turned, her eyes fixed on Adele. Do you remember what I told you when we parted? If I fail, you must return to the ruins and use my remains to become the new primordial demoness. Cheek doesn't want to become an outer deity, because that means there's a high probability of losing herself. Given her actions, she would face even stronger resistance from the City of Calamity. But, if that's the case, then it seems we don't necessarily have to be hostile towards Cheek. After all, compared to a primordial demoness, we'd rather not see the City of Calamity awaken, wouldn't we? Adele first nodded, then remembered some things and continued to question Gegran. The City of Calamity doesn't correspond to just one pathway. That fool Cheek doesn't seem to realize this, still thinking she is the City of Calamity's only choice. Gegran sneered, this is its conspiracy. The Hunter pathway currently has no true god. Even if Cheek occupies the demoness pathway and doesn't become an outer deity, the City of Calamity can still influence the Hunter pathway, forming a new Chongshan from this vacant position. At that time, Cheek will be completely unable to resist the City of Calamity, which will have mastered the Hunter pathway, and she will become a complete outer deity. Simply put, the only way out for us is to push Cheek down ourselves, then use the City of Calamity to accommodate the true god of the Hunter pathway, ultimately achieving the status of an outer deity, and then gamble that we can at least achieve a stalemate in the game with it. Gegran's expression was somewhat complex. She seemed to try her best to appear relieved, but failed several times, only letting out a heavy sigh. It has laid the gamble before us. Only by betting everything we have can we compete with it. Her voice, abandoning its previous charm, was as heavy as cast iron. It can lose many times, but if we lose even once, we'll be kicked off the table. You are currently only sequence 6, not yet a demigod, and haven't seen what's inside your door. You still have a chance to turn back. This was the first time Gegran had advised Adele to give up. Although this demoness before her was brought into the pathway by her own hands, she still wanted to give her a chance to quit. Hypocritical. Gegran wasn't sure, but she knew that a demoness should be like this. She suddenly wanted to give this child a chance to withdraw, so she did it, with no reason, and needing no other reason. At least, if you give up, your future will definitely be more stable than it is now. Gegran's words were cut short because Adele suddenly interrupted her. This was the first time she had interrupted Gegran tonight. If the future is already determined, is it still the future? Adele looked up at the cosmos outside the window, so I refuse. Chapter 358, Caught in the Game. The next day, Adele and her 2 companions arrived at the Baron's Port naval base. With Gegran's ability, entering the naval base silently would only take a little effort, but Adele didn't want to be too direct. After all, she didn't know if the founder was at the naval base, and a conflict could lead to unpredictable consequences. Lieutenant Cersei, weren't you supposed to stay in Elise? The naval soldier at the gate asked in surprise when he saw Adele. There were some unexpected developments, Adele vaguely replied. Please inform Vice Admiral White that there's someone here who needs to see him. All right, please wait a moment. The soldier didn't dare to delay and immediately ran to inform Emmeline. This gentleman and Miss Hall are members of the same organization. He is more senior than I am and has considerable autonomy in many matters. Currently, he is in charge of the logistics for the entire Loan Expeditionary Force. Adele introduced Gegran in advance. If you plan to do anything on the southern continent, it's best to inform him and the founder Augustus beforehand to avoid conflicts. You can decide these matters yourself. Gegran waved her hand casually, not caring much about these details, trusting Adele to handle them well. The 3 didn't wait long before Emmeline White, dressed in military uniform, walked in quickly from the entrance. After seeing Adele, he hesitated for a moment, seemingly considering how to communicate with her, before finally speaking to Adele. You did well. That ship full of artworks is enough to silence many people. Before Adele and the others, the Snowwind had already returned to Baron's Port with the spoils of war and completed the unloading yesterday. Emmeline White was just in his office checking the inventory report. Originally, the complete annihilation of the reinforcing ironclad ship would have been enough for Emmeline to lose his official position, but this batch of spoils of war was enough to silence most of the military personnel coveting Emmeline's position. Emmeline himself belonged to an ancient Beander race and was also a foreign guest of the Earth Mother Church, making his identity quite sensitive. As long as the Earth Mother Church did not abandon its support for him, and his actions were not too outrageous, the internal forces of the kingdom's military alone could not bring him down. Even with this batch of ironclad ships, the kingdom's army could not quickly achieve victory, and even without this batch of ironclad ships, the kingdom's military would not lose to the Rose School of Thought. The naval fleet was merely icing on the cake for the Loan military, far from being a crucial aid in times of need. Moreover, the sinking of the fleet was actually unrelated to Emmeline, as no one could have known beforehand that such a planet would suddenly rise from underground. The military needed to find a scapegoat, but now that Emmeline had tangible spoils of war, even the kingdom's military couldn't be too harsh on him. More important than the value of these artworks is their significance in appearing here. Adele did not overemphasize her role but subtly changed the subject. They symbolize the development process of human art. More than artworks, they are like a history book, possessing excellent commemorative significance, and are priceless treasures of Intis. And now, the situation that requires the Intis people to give away these priceless treasures has arisen, or rather, the Intis people and the 3 Lindbergh nations believe that this situation has arisen. Adele hinted, and seeing Emmeline nod in understanding, as if he had already thought of this point, she did not dwell on it further. Instead, she stepped back, making way for Gegran behind her. This is my former teacher whom I mentioned, the sprout of the tree of disaster, the symbol of destruction and rebirth, the lord of plagues and calamities, Medea Gegran. Adele introduced to Emmeline. Not long ago, she became a sequence 2 angel. Emmeline's habitual proud smile instantly stiffened and shattered. When Adele recited Gegran's honorific name, the aura of the lady before him seemed to instantly suppress him, making him almost uncontrollably tremble. He had only experienced this feeling when meeting, Full Moon, Ulmer. Emmeline stiffly extended his hand, and the beautiful lady also walked towards him, gently shaking his fingertips. The warm sensation traveled up Emmeline's fingers, bringing him back to his senses, and he quickly bowed in greeting. A Sequence 2 terrestrial angel is a great existence equivalent to a pope in any church. Although Emmeline's reputation in the Earth Mother Church was quite intimidating, he was still bound to be at a disadvantage when facing a true angel. Fortunately, Gegran did nothing out of line. She merely nodded at Emmeline, then sat back in her seat, and then said in a soft voice, "Zatwin has been killed by me. Now, the troops along the East Balam line have no demigod guarding them. You can launch a full-scale attack with confidence. If necessary, I will directly participate to assist." Gegran's tone was gentle, without any hint of killing intent, as if she wasn't talking about killing a demigod and preparing to kill more people, but rather going to a clothing store to buy a new dress. Before Emmeline could react, Gegran pulled out a light gray tree-shaped crystal from her robe pocket. In its center was a perfectly round eyeball, surrounded by branch-like crystalline hairs. "This is Zatwin's Beyander characteristic. You can confirm it." Gegran placed the Beyander characteristic on the table, intending to push it towards Emmeline. No need. Emmeline felt his heart pounding rapidly. Although a sanguine's heartbeat was normally slower than a regular person's, his heart was still beating very fast. His demigod-level spiritual intuition clearly told him that this was indeed the Beyander characteristic of Zatwin, the Rose School of Thought demigod who had been causing him trouble on the rear battlefield and with logistics, no fake whatsoever. "I will contact His Royal Highness Prince Augustus immediately. It would be best to launch a counterattack at once, before the developments in Elise spread to the front lines of the Hagati grassland. We need a decisive blow to reverse the situation." Emmeline's face showed an irrepressible excitement. This war had lasted for more than half a year, and the Rose School of Thought's resistance was more tenacious than anyone had expected. It had to end as soon as possible, otherwise, this place would become a bottomless pit devouring believers of gods, slowly eroding the Orthodox God Church's power against outer deities. That would be best. Gegran bowed gracefully, watching Emmeline hurriedly walk out the door to contact William Augustus. She then softly said to Adele beside her, "Do you feel it? Now, you are in the game." "In the game?" Adele was slightly startled. "There are two kinds of people in the world. Those in the game and those outside the game. You once told me that if the future is already destined, then it's not a future, but deep down, you want to know what your future holds more than anyone else." Gegran smiled slightly, "And the most important point is that you only want to know. As for accepting it or not, that probably depends on whether this future aligns with your wishes." "You almost made me believe it." Adele laughed wryly. "From beginning to end, I have always acted under your, Miss Hall's, or someone else's arrangements. Do you think I'm the kind of hothead who would make a big fuss over a small loss?" Gegran smiled and did not continue to explain, merely waiting quietly for the results of Emmeline's contact with William Augustus. Regardless of the outcome, it would mean that the situation on the southern continent battlefield would undergo earth-shattering changes. Meanwhile, near the Gargith archipelago, on a small island several hundred nautical miles from the capital, Nas. Here, like Constant City, the whaling industry was thriving. White stone whaling houses were visible everywhere, and massive white whales were dismembered inside into hide, meat, fat, bones, and gray amber. The latter two were used, one for making crinolines for ball gowns, and the other as a top-grade spice. Whether used as incense or added to perfumes, both were luxuries only enjoyed by nobles and wealthy individuals. However, this place was now completely abandoned, the whaling houses no longer operating, because someone had occupied it, turning the city into a temporary foothold, and few residents on the island survived. The God of Combat Church's strategic withdrawal was not just limited to Indo-Port. Fosak people had no qualms abandoning overseas colonies like Nas, which were far from their homeland. Beside the island, a massive, gloomy, dark sailing ship was docked. This sailing ship was nearly 200 meters long, with high bows and sterns, its overall shape resembling a crescent moon. Its surface was painted black, with cannons staggered in 3 rows along the sides, orderly arranged. The parts protruding from the deck, apart from the masts, were equally towering and massive, at least equivalent to a 5-story building. The most peculiar thing about this ship was that it only had one sail, on which a black tombstone was depicted. This was the Harbinger of Death, one of the most famous and legendary ships on the 5 seas, the flagship of the undying King Agorito. Not long ago, Agorito occupied this small island. There was no specific reason, it was just along the way, so Agorito ordered an attack and occupation, causing a massacre whose scale was limited by the size of the island. However, this time Agorito did not rush to leave as usual, but instead anchored on this island, seemingly waiting for something. Inside the Harbinger of Death's inner cabin, which no outsider had ever entered, the pale-faced undying King Agorito, who looked as if he could rot and die at any moment, was sitting on a soft sofa with blood-red patterns, enveloped by a viscous black mist filled with a decadent and evil scent. Opposite him sat a slender figure in a black robe, completely covered from head to toe by the robe. Only his voice suggested he might be male. He wore a brass bird beak mask on his face, blocking Agorito's faint attempts at detection. "Who exactly are you, and what do you want from me?" Agorito's voice was sharp, causing an instinctive discomfort upon hearing it, like someone drilling into the listener's brain. "I've introduced myself. I am the first pillar of the Moses ascetic order, atheism." The black-robed man cleared his throat. "I'm here to discuss a collaboration with the undying king. If you need pirates to do something, don't you have your own king of pirates? Why don't you seek out the Star Queen instead of coming to me?" Agorito did not agree rashly but asked playfully, his internal alarm bells already ringing loudly, ready to counterattack at any moment. Agorito knew that the 10 pillars of the Moses ascetic order varied in strength. He also knew that Katlia, who had broken through to sequence 3, was merely the 3rd pillar in the Moses ascetic order, and the 2nd pillar, Dullness, Albert Noss, was rumored to have even reached sequence 2. So, what this suddenly appearing 1st pillar meant was something Agorito had to carefully consider. Rejection has another mission and needs to go in a different direction. The black-robed, atheism, said unhurriedly, "Most of the other pillars also have their own matters, so I need you to do this." "What is it?" Agorito swallowed. "What benefits can I get? It's a pillaging mission you'll like. How much you gain completely depends on how much you can snatch," atheism said softly. "The target is Indo-Port. You must have noticed the unusual activity of the Harbinger of Death. I don't believe you yourself don't want to attack there. If successful, you might be able to smoothly control the Harbinger of Death, instead of being its slave. Why are you so sure I'll agree to help you?" Suppressing his surprise at the newcomer exposing the secret between him and the Harbinger of Death, Agorito probed, "I don't seem to have this obligation." "You certainly don't." A rustling sound came from within atheism's black robe. "Just as you don't have the right to refuse." Just as Agorito was about to retort, he saw the black-robed figure opposite slowly extend an arm made of metal splicing from his sleeve, little by little removing the bird beak mask from his face. Then, Agorito saw an invisible black void, with 7 spherical eyes floating within it. Without warning, Agorito's pale skin began to rot, large chunks of flesh falling from his skeleton, covered in glowing green mold. The thick black mist surrounding him automatically surged into his body, filling the missing parts, and it took a while for him to return to his original state, making Agorito appear even more haggard and emaciated. Clutching the armrest of the sofa, Agorito said bitterly, "When do you want me to act?" Atheism put his mask back on and said in an unperturbed tone, "Set off now. Materialism will cooperate with you. We won't force you to die. If an opponent appears that you cannot deal with, you can escape at any time." After speaking, his figure mysteriously vanished, along with the black robe, transforming into an invisible stream of information, leaving only the gloomy-faced Agorito sitting alone in the captain's cabin. Chapter 359, Serial Killer. Agorito in the captain's cabin had an ashen face. Atheism gave him a very bad feeling, reminding him of his situation before advancing to sequence 4. Rumors that Agorito was not a demigod had not reached sequence 4, and only became one of the 4 kings because of the Harbinger of Death, were not unfounded. He indeed had a period where he was controlled by the Harbinger of Death. It wasn't until recently, when he used previously released false information to trick adventurers into completing a ritual, that he completed his advancement and became a Sequence 4 demon, which slightly improved his status from a slave to an assistant and collaborator. Out of a desire for secrecy, he did not spread this news, waiting to continue deceiving some arrogant bounty hunters with the false information that he had not yet completed his advancement. However, atheism directly found the harbinger of death in the vast ocean and then used its own strength to tell Agurito directly, even if you become a demigod, it makes no difference to an angel, you still have to bow and scrape. Only before it was to the harbinger of death, and now it is to atheism and the Moses ascetic order. Damn it! Agurito's expression twisted, and he slammed his fist on the table. At this moment, the blood-red wall suddenly twisted, and the cracks on the wall panel opened and closed, like a gaping mouth, seemingly wanting to say something to Agurito. I've told you many times, don't be impatient, harbinger of death. Agurito roared irritably, but soon, seemingly having heard something from the harbinger of death, his expression became playful. Is that so? Good, I understand, I hadn't expected that, or rather, I couldn't have expected it. As if injected with a stimulant, Agurito swept away his previous despondency, straightened the black tricorn hat on his head, and the skin on his throat turned demonized dark red. He issued a command to the entire island in a sharp, hoarse voice. Pack up, we're leaving here tomorrow for Indo Port. His voice was sharp and malicious, echoing continuously across the island, sometimes hoarse, sometimes chaotic, sometimes like a whisper, sometimes like singing, making it unbearable for normal people. However, the pirates on the harbinger of death showed no abnormalities. Hearing the evil, hoarse voice, they merely swayed slightly, then their eyes turned red, they stopped what they were doing, clenched their fists and struck their chests, then uniformly began preparations before setting sail. At Indo Port, Sophie was enjoying some precious, alone, time. During this time, she had been disciplined by Mr. Ask, and the overly conscientious Ask's tasks for her were not easy. In the past few months, she had already finished learning basic Hermes language, and next she would learn Elven language and Dragon language. According to Ask, this was knowledge a Beander must understand, but Sophie was highly skeptical of this. And now, both Vianata and Ask were overwhelmed by the sudden increase in mystical incidents. Without revealing their own great power, even angels couldn't resolve these matters overnight. It seems you've finally thought it through. In Sophie's mind, Chesha watched as Sophie carefully put on the lie necklace gifted by Miss Audrey and hid the revolver adjusted by Vianata under her skirt, and couldn't help but confirm. Actually, I haven't mentally prepared myself either. Sophie responded softly, but even though I didn't stay long in the cold-blooded stage, that unforgettable experience made me realize one thing. Even if I'm not prepared, what needs to be done won't just disappear on its own. Behind the 22 divine pathways lies the crystallization of wisdom from countless ancient gods of the second epoch, and the potion system is no different. Any action that deviates from these 22 divine pathways is destined to be accompanied by risk. Although theoretically, the clever method proposed by Derek of the Sun, which involves consuming the potion after extracting emotions at sequence 9 to accelerate the digestion of the cold-blooded, and then re-infusing them after advancing to sequence 7, has sufficient theoretical basis, it also presents difficulties. For a sequence 8 cold-blooded who has lost all humanity, the precious emotions re-infused upon advancing to sequence 7 are like boiling water poured onto snow. To maintain humanity, one must prevent this, boiling water, from freezing, and the difficulty of this can be imagined. When advancing to sequence 7, if Audrey hadn't been there to help and stabilize Sophie's mental state in time, Chesha would probably have had to intervene, otherwise Sophie would have faced only loss of control. However, it was precisely because of this that Sophie's psyche matured once again, almost worlds apart from her peers, and this experience of pouring beautiful emotions into an emotionless inner self indeed gave her new insights, making her more at ease with her own destiny. It's good that you know. Chesha nodded and stopped speaking. The subsequent matters, even she couldn't easily interfere with. Sophie had to complete the role-playing of the serial killer herself. Demon Pathway Sequence 7, Serial Killer, masters various knowledge and rituals of demon worship, and enjoys pleasing demons with special serial murder cases. Given enough time, they can summon projections of demons from the abyss. They can effectively interfere with divination and psychical communication. However, the role-playing requirements for a serial killer are also quite sinister. Commit serial murders, the more brutal the methods and the more people killed consecutively, the better. Moreover, it is only effective when killing one's own kind, which differs somewhat from a hunter who hunts different species. Sophie pulled out a notebook from her Wiley, which recorded some targets she had secretly investigated these past few days. Some were suspicious outsiders Vianata had investigated during this period, others were wrongdoers Sophie herself had found. The latter's judgment method was not difficult. Sophie simply found an underground Beander gathering. After the Esco family changed its name to Queen Island Shipping Company, these Beander gatherings, which had been suppressed by the family, resurfaced. Sophie used lie to slightly alter her figure and appearance, memorized the bounty list inside from beginning to end, and then tracked and investigated each target from highest to lowest bounty, eventually finding 7 targets. If it's just playing a serial killer, the requirements aren't too high. It only asks for the creation of serial murders, with a minimum of 7 and a maximum of 13 for the ritual. There are no specific requirements for the chosen targets. The longest interval between 2 murders is 9 days, otherwise the ritual resets. The shortest is 3 days, and shorter than 3 days increases the risk of losing control. Let's go find the first target. It might take a whole day. Chesha was enthusiastic. After all, she was indeed tired of murder and found it hard to get excited about it. I left a note for Sister Vianata. Sophie nodded. Although Adele and Vianata had already confirmed their relationship, in front of outsiders, Sophie still called Vianata sister, and Adele mom, which gradually became her habit. Tying her shoelaces, Sophie slipped out the back door alone. After confirming no one was paying attention, she quickly took several turns and disappeared. Just after Sophie disappeared, a corner of the curtain on the 2nd floor was pulled open. Vianata stood by the window with a complex expression, holding a neatly written note that read, "I'm going to start role-playing today, might be back very late tonight. If you want, you can follow her and see." Annie walked past her and urged her when she saw Vianata's expression. "What do you know?" Vianata retorted absent-mindedly, "Children always have to grow up. I can't always follow her around. Even if she's going to kill someone next." Annie raised an eyebrow, pressing on. "Half of that list was copied by you." Vianata rolled her eyes at Annie, then stared blankly for a while in the direction where Sophie's figure had disappeared, letting out a heavy sigh. "None of us are good people, and we are neither qualified nor able to demand her to be pure and flawless. All we can do is try our best to keep her from going too far in that direction." Like madness and loss of control, Vianata didn't say the latter half of the sentence. No Beander can escape loss of control and madness, all they can do is try not to go mad too early or too severely. While Vianata was still hesitating, Sophie was already on her way. According to the information found from Vianata, Sophie's first target was an Intis man named Salvatore Black, suspected to be an peripheral member of the Iron and Blood Cross Order. His behavior was often abnormal, and he seemed to have some inappropriate ideas about the exclusive residences arranged by the Queen Island Shipping Company for Beander travelers. He was the type Vianata would eventually have to deal with, even if Sophie didn't act. Because he was only an peripheral member, Salvatore was not a Beander of the Hunter pathway, but a Sequence 7 shadow ascetic of the Secret Supplicant pathway. He could freely lurk in shadows, and his abilities were very suitable for stealth assassination. If not for the listener prerequisite sequence making him appear too neurotic on many occasions, attracting Vianata's attention, he would have been a good assassin. But now, Sophie had her eyes on this guy. Entering through the main door for a direct confrontation would be a good method, as a shadow ascetic is not a sequence skilled in direct conflict. However, directly fighting a true creator's mad believers involves too many variables and could easily cause a commotion. Even if Sophie successfully killed Salvatore, she wouldn't be able to follow up and complete the ritual. Therefore, Sophie circled the apartment building and quickly noticed the ventilation shaft, but its size was only slightly larger than Sophie's head, which Sophie estimated to be at most 40 centimeters wide. However, this did not stop Sophie. Abyss Pathway Sequence 7, Serial Killer. After advancing to a mid-sequence, they master more reliable active Beander abilities, including poisonous fire, simple, malicious words, type curses, and some demonization abilities. And depending on the materials used by each person during advancement, the demonized forms also vary greatly. Sophie's Beander characteristic originated from Mathafari, and was also influenced by Cheshire Midway, allowing her to exhibit two tendencies, the former's infernal lord form and the latter's Gorgon form. Sophie found a hidden corner to hide, then softly chanted the demonization activation incantation, making her body boneless, like a real snake, and slipped into the maintenance channel on the top of the apartment building through the ventilation shaft that humans absolutely couldn't enter. She set her demonization activation word to the Hermes language, demon. The reason she didn't use the demon language was because her mysticism lessons hadn't reached that point yet, and she couldn't say the demon language words before transforming into a demon. Both Sophie and Salvatore were sequence 7, and Sophie had the advantage of striking first, quietly hiding inside Salvatore's rented apartment. This believer of the true creator from Intis had a typical appearance. A lean but distinguished face, thick hair, a significant difference from the middle-aged gentleman of Loan. At this moment, he was sitting in front of the fireplace in his room, devoutly praying towards an inverted cross emblem nested within another. Sophie's position was directly above him, separated from his head by only a thumb-thick iron grate. "Great Lord, what do you wish to tell me?" Salvatore prostrated himself devoutly on the ground, adopting an exceptionally humble posture. Even the most respectful student listening to a lecture had never shown such an expression. If one ignored his face, contorted from listening, and the drool flowing from the corners of his mouth, he might have appeared somewhat like a devout believer. However, now, all Sophie saw was evil. Unlike demons, whose corruption comes from the abyss, closer to physical corruption, induced by external interference, Salvatore's corruption, however, emanated from within. The true creator's whispers seemed only to awaken his inner corrupt tendencies. And now, the voice Salvatore heard was like a booming bell in his senses, completely obscuring the subtle movements Sophie made in the ventilation shaft. However, just as Sophie was about to launch a sneak attack while the other party was listening to the whispers and suffering from nervous exhaustion, she suddenly heard Salvatore muttering. "I heard. You said, there's a girl hiding in the ventilation shaft above my head, preparing to assassinate me." At the same time, his neck twisted grotesquely, forming an exaggerated acute angle with his spine, and his dark, hollow eyes stared directly at Sophie in the air. Sophie immediately knew something was wrong. She sharply contracted her body, then burst forth with force, twisting off the hollow iron grate, which was as thick as a thumb, and plummeted from the air towards Salvatore, her revolver roaring with flames. However, Salvatore was not hit. His body melted like wax, flowing directly into the shadows on the ground, using his ability to hide in shadows to evade Sophie's first wave of attack. Sophie landed lightly, but the room was already empty. The floor was covered with a layer of dark shadows, which spread out like ripples as Sophie walked. Time is running short today, this last paragraph is a placeholder, we'll update later. Chapter 360 Playing the Role. However, just as Sophie was about to launch a surprise attack while Salvatore was on the verge of a nervous breakdown from listening to the ravings, she suddenly heard him murmur. "I heard. You said there's a girl hiding in the ventilation shaft above my head, preparing to assassinate me." At the same time, his neck twisted grotesquely, forming an exaggerated acute angle with his spine, and his hollow eyes stared straight at Sophie in the air. Sophie immediately knew something was wrong. She quickly retracted her body, then exploded with force, twisting off the thumb-thick hollow iron grate directly, and plummeted from the air towards Salvatore, her revolver roaring with flames. However, Salvatore was not hit. His figure melted like wax, flowing directly into the shadows on the ground, using his ability to hide in the shadows to evade Sophie's first wave of attacks. Sophie landed lightly, but the room was now empty. A layer of dark shadows covered the ground, spreading out like ripples with Sophie's footsteps. Sophie moved cautiously, positioning herself against the wall to prevent Salvatore from ambushing her from her blind spot. The room was silent. Salvatore made no movement, but the shadows on the ground continued to ripple, meaning Salvatore had not left, but was hiding in the shadows, monitoring Sophie. Very cautious. He hasn't exposed his attack methods or revealed more information. Instead, he's hiding, waiting for me to expose my abilities first. Sophie's thoughts raced, and she leaned against the wall, as if the wall could provide her with a sense of security. Then, under Sophie's gaze, the puddle of flowing shadows in front of her suddenly became active, bubbling like boiling water, constantly splashing viscous, oily black liquid. Sophie tightened her grip on the revolver, cautiously aiming the muzzle at the black shadow on the ground. As she moved, purple flames suddenly erupted from the gaps in her revolver's magazine and its barrel. This was a poisonous fire with a fallen connotation. Even believers of the true Creator could not completely ignore this impurity-like flame. They would still be burned and harmed by it, though the destructive effect was not as obvious as it was on ordinary humans or beyonders who controlled positive power. Bang! Sophie pulled the trigger, and a bullet burning with purple flames shot directly at the black shadow, leaving a faint purplish trail in the air. However, at the very instant Sophie fired and the gun's report drowned out other sounds, her own shadow on the wall behind her suddenly moved like ripples. Then, two arm-like shadow tentacles silently emerged from the shadow behind her, launching a sudden attack the moment Sophie initiated her offensive. The Beyonder ability of a Sequence 7 Shadow Ascetic, simply put, revolves around shadows. He can transform into a near-liquid state, perfectly merging into shadows, and can also use shadow magic, manipulating shadows to form various types of weapons for attack. He can also use the opponent's shadow to cast curses on enemies. And when merging into shadows, a shadow ascetic can still use the latter two abilities, meaning that simply leaning against a wall is useless, because a shadow ascetic can directly summon an attack from the shadow behind the enemy without his complete body appearing in the real world. Launching an attack from the shadow within Sophie's line of sight was Salvatore's deliberate plan. Diverting others' attention was as normal for him as eating and breathing. The attack from her own shadow was impossible to guard against, and even if Sophie wanted to dodge, it was too late. With two poochie sounds, Sophie's body tilted slightly forward from the impact, but she quickly straightened herself. The two shadowed tentacles seemed to lose their strength instantly, drooping limply on her shoulders. Sophie slowly turned around. Her braided hair on her back had somehow come undone, and her green curly hair, like real snakes, had split into two to bite the attacking pair of tentacles, attempting to drag the opponent's main body out of the shadows. Salvatore was in ambush, but wasn't Sophie also ambushing him? Even the partial demonization of a Sequence 7 demon pathway Beyonder can significantly alter human perception of such Beyonders. For example, using snake-like hair disguised within normal hair for reconnaissance, even attacks from behind can be easily dealt with by Sophie. She leaned against the wall not because it was his blind spot, but because she wanted to make others believe it was her blind spot. This allowed her to make many targeted arrangements. Compared to an opponent who meticulously plans a sneak attack from behind, knowing in advance which direction or where the opponent will strike is obviously much more efficient. For one thing, a meticulous schemer like Salvatore is more likely to fall into Sophie's trap. Sophie's eyes turned red, and more snake-like strands of hair grew wildly, directly dragging Salvatore, who was hiding in the shadows, out. A shadow ascetic can indeed become pure liquid, but there is a consumption each time it is used, and this consumption is related to the richness of the user's spirituality. At Sequence 7, a shadow ascetic can use this spell a maximum of 3 times a day, and he had already used it once when dodging the assassination from above. He still had one last chance, and among mid-sequence Beyonders, this ability was considered a miracle. However, Sophie would not allow Salvatore to regain his footing, so she bit down hard on his body, which hadn't fully digitized yet, and directly dragged him out of the shadowy expanse, while her right hand had already grown sharp claws, reaching out to grasp Salvatore's body. Unexpectedly, Salvatore did not use a secret technique to escape, so this claw strike landed squarely, accurately gouging a piece of flesh from Salvatore's body, causing him to scream in pain. However, he quickly suppressed his painful cries, and at the cost of another piece of flesh being gouged out by Sophie, he once again hid in the shadows. But now, Sophie no longer feared Salvatore's ability to conceal himself. She quickly grabbed the blood-stained piece of flesh from the ground, activated partial demonization, and cursed the piece of meat in demonic language. As soon as Sophie spoke, a muffled grunt came from the shadows behind her, and when Sophie spoke the second sentence, Salvatore could no longer endure it, spitting out a large mouthful of fresh blood and falling out of the shadows, no longer having the strength to maintain his previous hidden state. Between his waist and abdomen, the wound where Sophie had dug out a piece of flesh suddenly began to rapidly rot and fester, which directly interrupted his prayer, causing the already accumulated and formed spell to die in its infancy. Seeing Sophie, whose appearance had been altered by the disguise, approaching, Salvatore's mind did not immediately shut down. Instead, he calmly began to think, and realizing that escape was hopeless, he slumped against the wall. "What is your purpose in coming here?" Sophie asked directly. "If you explain clearly, I can let you leave with some dignity." "That's not something you should know," Salvatore replied calmly. "However, if you're really interested, then why don't you listen for yourself?" Just as he finished his last sentence, his face suddenly changed dramatically, becoming twisted and grotesque. All the blood in his head seemed to flow around his ears and mouth, making other areas pale, while these two parts became engorged. A prelude-like, noisy, illusory, and evil raving instantly spread, making Sophie's scalp tingle and making it difficult for her to concentrate her thoughts. No human language could accurately describe this sound. All the blood vessels on Sophie's head bulged and rolled outwards. The preceding pathway of a shadow ascetic is a listener, anciently called a whisperer, who can directly hear the whispers of corresponding hidden existences. Therefore, they often gain many powerful, distorted, and unique abilities. However, correspondingly, if they cannot achieve advancement, it is difficult for them to survive for more than 5 years. All listeners are lunatics, even if they appear normal in everyday life, they are definitely hidden lunatics. Even without actively using the Beyonder ability of listening, they will hear more in a normal environment than ordinary people and most low and mid-sequence Beyonders. When the sound source is close enough, they will be more greatly affected and gain more dangerous information. Among the Beyonder abilities of a listener, the most classic is the almost unreasonable retelling, which can make the opponent hear the same ravings as oneself, and one's own resistance to the true creator's ravings certainly exceeds that of most enemies. However, the range of this retelling is very small, less than 2 meters. In order to make Sophie actively enter this area, Salvatore did not hesitate to use himself as bait, luring Sophie into the effective range. However, he quickly discovered in despair that this somewhat short lady, after hearing the true creator's ravings being retold, actually possessed a unique resistance and recovered from that dazed state even before he could act. In reality, Sophie was not unafraid of the ravings, it was because Chesha, who was once an angel, was parasitic within her, and the cold-blooded characteristic of the demon pathway inherently had resistance to similar spiritual pollution. This combination resulted in her, despite being hit by the ravings, waking up even before Salvatore. Sophie staggered towards Salvatore, discarded her empty pistol, and drew the sailor's knife tied to the side of her leather boot, while Salvatore remained motionless. Relying on the innate characteristics brought by the demon pathway, Sophie accurately plunged the knife into Salvatore's heart, completely killing this peripheral member of the Iron and Blood Cross Order. Before she even acted, she had already set up a spirituality wall outside the door, isolating the sounds from within. The moment she killed the opponent, Sophie felt a strange sensation in her heart, as if something within her had shattered. Having already received relevant education, she understood that this was a sign of the initial digestion of the potion. The Demon Pathways Sequence 7, the serial killer, mastered many knowledge and rituals for worshipping devils, and enjoyed pleasing devils with special serial killer cases. Given enough time, they could summon projections of devils from the abyss. They could effectively interfere with divination and psychometry. And their acting requirements were quite heinous. Creating serial killer cases, the more cruel the methods, and the more people killed consecutively, the better, and only killing their own kind was effective. Furthermore, the inherent nature brought by the devil part of their bodies also made them actively please devils, performing various cruel rituals using humans as materials, leading their titles to frequently appear in multiple horror stories, including the Bloody Butcher, who serially killed 5 young girls, some taking hearts, others stomachs, and the Ripper, who successively murdered women with signs of depravity, representing a series of devils, and so on. To digest the potion, there's also a series of rituals to please the devil later on, Chesha reminded her. The demon pathway has always been feared by many, and the rituals they leave behind after committing crimes, which symbolize primitive devil worship, are also one of the very important reasons. Among these rituals, the most representative are the removal of internal organs and the blood eagle. The latter is generally performed by the executioner himself, who makes 2 incisions near the chest cavity along both sides of the spine on the victim's back, then breaks the ribs, and finally pulls the victim's lungs out of the chest cavity with both hands. When the lungs leave the chest cavity, due to pressure and sufficient space, they rapidly contract, and the victim will suffocate to death from inability to breathe. Because the 2 lungs protruding from the back look very much like retracted wings, this form of punishment is commonly known as the blood eagle. As for the ritual of removing internal organs, it is even more varied. Countless devils constantly innovate on this pathway, adding countless precedents to sacrificial rituals. Must I do it? Sophie was silent for a moment, then glanced at Salvatore's corpse lying on the ground. At this moment, his meander characteristic was slowly precipitating, and a long, strip-shaped black crystal cluster was growing from his chest. Chesha didn't speak, but merely nodded. Sophie didn't continue to be awkward. She bent down and softly chanted in demonic language. Wisps of faint light flew from the opponent's corpse, swallowed by the snake-like hair flying around Sophie. That was Salvatore's spirit, which would allow these spirits to be preserved longer until Sophie found someone to commune with. Afterward, Sophie drew her knife, moved Salvatore's body to the center of the room, and continued to release the demonic language curse, causing the skin on his wrists and ankles to crack, and bones to protrude outwards, though not much blood flowed. Sophie grasped the exposed bones. The connection between bone and flesh had been eliminated by mystical means. Sophie, without much effort, pulled out the ulna from his forearm, then used the ulna to nail through his palm. She repeated the same trick with his feet, nailing Salvatore into the likeness of a martyr from the Church's holy scriptures. Sophie felt something disappearing in her heart, but the potion was indeed being digested. Today again, I'm exhausted from driving all afternoon. I'll post first and revise later. There might be a repeated section earlier. Chapter 361 Chase. After setting up the ritual, Sophie put away Salvatore's meander characteristic and prepared to leave the scene. Since the acting requirement demanded continuous crimes, the meander abilities of a demon pathway meander naturally included rituals to interfere with divination and erase traces. Sophie sprinkled the pre-prepared scent-eliminating potion on herself, then walked to the window, preparing to leave through it. Before leaving, Sophie pulled open a crack in the thick velvet curtain and cautiously peeked outside. She had spent a lot of time waiting for the right moment and dealing with the scene. Now, dusk had fallen, and faint candlelight spilled from the apartments on both sides of the street, intertwining with the crimson moonlight struggling to penetrate the clouds, barely outlining the figures of pedestrians on the street. Walking on the street were individuals in old and tattered clothes, their expressions numb and filled with despair. They were demonstrators swept up in the parade. It was just as the day's protest was ending. The demonstrators had expended a great deal of energy shouting during the day, their lips dry and cracked, while the organizers from earlier had long since vanished. In Sophie's eyes, these figures gradually became illusory, no longer living people, but rather dying embers, destined either to burn something down with their last sparks or to become ashes in the hearth. If it had been before, she might have felt pity for their plight, saddened by their fate of being coerced into burning away their remaining value until the very end. But now, she had no more capacity for sympathy. The potion's effect had extinguished almost all of her compassion. Finally, Sophie could only sigh softly, the sound rippling gently in the quiet room. If I leave the room now, I might be seen by these people. Sophie carefully lowered the curtain and sat down beside Salvatore. His eyes had lost their focus, his blood almost completely drained, the remaining portion forming purplish-red stains beneath him. No information linking him to other forces was found in his room, only some of Salvatore's weapons and equipment, and unconscious scribbles he had left when he heard things he shouldn't have. Just now, she had confirmed that his soul had completely collapsed due to the murmurs he heard before death. Even though Sophie collected it relatively quickly, she still couldn't divine enough information and eventually had to give up. Just as Sophie waited quietly for this group of protesters to leave, she suddenly heard a knock at the door. In the quiet room, the sound was particularly jarring. Someone's here. Could it be Salvatore's accomplice? Sophie took a deep breath, quickly recalling the layout of the apartment. She realized that no matter where she left the apartment, the visitor at the door might notice, because the apartment's main door faced the corridor window, offering an excellent view. With a shift in thought, Sophie quickly made a decision, quietly moved to the bedroom, and curled up under the bed. Instead of rashly leaving and exposing myself, it's better to wait here and see what kind of person this guy is. Sophie thought to herself, if it's just an ordinary person, I can take advantage of them calling the police to leave. If it's a Beyonder, hiding myself will give me a small head start. Unlike assassins who only kill designated targets, Beyonders of the demon pathway have always been this way. After all, killing one is killing two is also killing. In fact, killing the guy who comes seeking revenge can better promote the digestion of the demon pathway Beyonder's potion. Hiding under the bed, Sophie silently activated her demonization. The dimples on her face silently deepened downwards, forming special cheek pits. Like a real snake, this facial pit could detect the position and body temperature of surrounding creatures like infrared, and this heat vision would still work even if objects were blocking it. At the same time, the parts of her body in contact with the ground also became more sensitive, allowing her to determine the opponent's stride frequency and length from subtle ground vibrations. A soft click came from the door. The person seemed to have covertly pried open the lock in some way and entered Salvatore's room. In Sophie's heat vision, the person's body temperature seemed lower than a normal person's, carrying an eerie scent. And based on the subtle differences between two steps, Sophie judged that the person was a middle-aged man, not very heavy, with a fast pace and large strides, about 1.7 meters tall, which was below average for a Fosak male. The person clearly paused at the door, presumably shocked after seeing Salvatore's corpse. Then he immediately quickened his movements, walked over to Salvatore, and squatted down, seemingly attempting to commune with the spirit. Sophie watched his movements quietly from under the bed, the potion's influence on her personality making her exceptionally calm now. Although killing the opponent was very tempting for a demon pathway Beyonder, to avoid losing control, she couldn't perform the ritual again within 3 days, so killing this person would be a bit of a waste. Moreover, she still didn't know the opponent's sequence and pathway, so rashly attacking could lead to problems. The person lingered in front of Salvatore for a while, seemingly realizing that his comrade's spirit had long since dissipated, and cursed softly. Sophie was very familiar with his accent, which was very similar to Azek Eggers's, a Fosak accent with a touch of southern continent Dudanese. Sophie heard it every day in class these past 2 days. Is the other party also someone who frequently travels to and from the southern continent? Sophie instinctively frowned. In this era, people who could speak the northern dialect of Fosak with a southern continent accent, besides anomalies like Azek who had spoken southern continent languages for so long that everything he said carried a southern continent accent, were only pirates who traveled back and forth between the northern and southern continents. And the pirate most fond of sailing between the northern and southern continents, Sophie immediately thought of Tracy, who used to be involved in the slave trade. Her fleet departed from Intis, using machinery produced by the Intis Steam Church to purchase slaves in the southern continent, and then resold the slaves to Mad Captain Connors Victor, earning a large fortune in the process. Now that Tracy and Adele had gone to the southern continent, her fleet was occupied by Lehman King, which meant that this guy was very likely the new pirate general, Shadow Lieutenant General, Lehman King. Sophie reviewed the information on his wanted poster in her mind and found that the physical characteristics generally matched. The rest could not be confirmed because the images seen through heat vision were not precise. This, relying solely on myself, I might not actually be able to handle. Sophie found herself in an awkward situation. She had originally thought that with Chesha's presence within her, and the ancient angel being able to exert sequence 5 level power, even if Salvatore's accomplice was stronger, she could easily escape. But now, the one who came was sequence 6 Lehman King, whose combat power, even with mystical items, was only equivalent to sequence 5, similar to Sophie's combat power with Chesha. This difference in strength made the situation very delicate. If Sophie fought by herself, she would likely suffer a great loss at the hands of the comprehensively capable Shadow Lieutenant General. If she called upon Chesha to control her body, gaining the upper hand wouldn't be a problem, but it would be difficult to keep the opponent, and it would needlessly expose the secret of Chesha's presence within her. Trying to escape now would mean Lehman King would see her at the crime scene, affecting her digestion, which would definitely be a small loss. However, if she ambushed Lehman King instead, she might be able to take him down, but she might also expose Chesh's existence, which would be a big loss. Sophie hid under the bed, clutching the revolver in her hand nervously, listening to the sounds from the living room. However, she soon felt something was amiss. The sounds from the living room were first rustling and dragging, then they became eerie, turning into crunching and chewing noises that sent shivers down Sophie's spine. He's eating Salvatore's corpse. Sophie inwardly cried out in alarm. Lehman King seemed to possess a mystical item from the secret supplicant pathway, corresponding to sequence 6 inches Rose Bishop. He seemed to be affected by the mystical item's side effects, becoming like a true Rose Bishop, fond of consuming fresh flesh and blood. The Rose Bishop's eating wasn't just eating, it could also read the information contained within the corpse, including the scene of Sophie's battle with Salvatore. Now, Sophie understood why Salvatore hadn't left any letters. For two believers of the true Creator to communicate, what need was there for letters? The flesh and blood used for messages had probably already been eaten by Salvatore. Then, she heard footsteps in the living room growing closer, walking directly into the bedroom, stopping at the doorway to look around. Sophie heard the newcomer's puzzled self-muttering of, "Devil," and saw the pair of brown sailor's loafers swaying back and forth before her eyes. She could even see bloodstains on the tips of his shoes. Sophie quietly swallowed. She had to do something. One hand continued to aim the gun at the corner of the bed, while Sophie's other hand had already quietly reached forward, grasping the lie necklace. She first slightly altered her appearance, then activated the manipulate flames ability attached to the lie necklace. On the candlestick in the living room, the flame suddenly swelled, shooting up over a meter high, illuminating the entire room as bright as day, then immediately extinguished, plunging the living room into darkness. While the opponent was distracted by the change in light and turned to look at the living room, Sophie rolled sharply from under the bed in the direction away from him. 3 toxic fireballs, the size of faces, shot out of her hand. 2 were flung at the opponent, and the remaining 1 smashed into the window, shattering the glass. Then Sophie quickly jumped up, preparing to leap out the window. The opponent seemed startled by the sudden attack, hurriedly waving his arm, causing the 2 toxic fireballs that were flying towards him to change direction, colliding and exploding in midair, forming a yellowish-green toxic cloud. Baron of Corruption's twist ability. It really is Lehman King, Shadow Lieutenant General. Sophie landed lightly. The street was completely empty at this moment, and she immediately started running wildly, escaping into the intricate environment on both sides of the street. After a brief deliberation, Sophie judged that Lehman King was not worth the risk of exposing Chesh's existence to forcibly detain him. She then forcefully reined in her malicious thoughts and turned to run, without any hesitation. Running into a dead end, Sophie activated her demonization, transforming her arm into a long snake. She was about to grab the top of the wall, preparing to directly climb over and shake off the pirate general following behind her. Just as Sophie was about to leave, Lehman King's eyes turned fierce. He stretched out a hand towards Sophie, made a virtual grasp, then violently pulled it to the side, simultaneously shouting in ancient Hermes. Twist. As the Shadow Lieutenant General's shout left his mouth, Sophie's outstretched long snake suddenly veered to the side, not grabbing the solid wall, but instead grabbing a clothesline used by a merchant to hang flags. Not only did it fail to pull her up, but it broke the clothesline, leaving Sophie with no leverage and causing her to fall back to the ground. Seeing that she couldn't jump away, Sophie used her demonized arm to coil around the sharply broken clothesline, throwing it like a javelin fiercely at her opponent. The physical enhancement from partial demonization made this strike incredibly powerful. In terms of strength alone, it was not much weaker than a warrior pathway's weapon master. However, Lehman King directly caught the flying clothesline with his bare hands. It only barely pierced his shoulder, stopped by his shoulder blade, causing only a minor flesh wound. Then, Lehman King pulled out the bamboo pole stuck in his shoulder and threw it back at Sophie. Perhaps due to the shoulder injury, the bamboo pole flew very slowly, far less forcefully than when it came, and Sophie easily blocked it. At this moment, Lehman King had already approached Sophie. Sophie immediately condensed a fireball of toxic fire beside her, trying to block his advance. However, the purplish-red toxic fire, originally convenient, quick, and powerful, now had a problem. The fireball in Sophie's hand seemed to lose its power, swaying crookedly twice, then extinguished with a pff sound. This was the bribery ability of the briber, the prerequisite sequence for Baron of Corruption. The reason the bamboo pole thrown earlier had no effect was because Lehman King didn't want this throw to be an attack, but rather a bribery, thereby weakening Sophie's combat ability. Seeing Sophie's combat power weakened, Lehman King did not let go of this excellent opportunity. He quickly closed the distance, his blood-red gauntlet cracking open like a gaping maw, directly biting towards Sophie's body. Just as Sophie was about to summon Chesha, a stream of blazing white flames suddenly ignited, soaring from behind the wall. After clearing the wall, it swooped down, colliding fiercely with the Shadow Lieutenant General with terrifying high temperature, sending him flying back 5 or 6 meters, rolling several times in a sorry state before extinguishing the flames on his body. The firelight gradually faded, and the newcomer slowly took off her hood, revealing her distinctive golden curly hair. It was Vianata, who had followed them. "Stay away from our child, you fool." Chapter 362, Deduction. Vianata stopped in front of Sophie, the flames around her finally extinguishing. She had held almost nothing back in the previous flame assault, yet the feeling of hitting her opponent was somewhat off. It seemed Lehman King had not been seriously injured, but merely pushed away by the explosion's shockwave. "Sister Vianata." Sophie readjusted her stance, standing slightly behind Vianata, watching the direction Lehman King had been sent flying with vigilance. Vianata's gaze fell on a charred leather glove on the ground. The other glove was still on Lehman King's wrist. "He threw the glove onto me at the last moment, fulfilling the prerequisite for bribery, thereby weakening my attack." Vianata frowned, realizing that the opponent's combat experience and on-the-spot reaction ability were both quite excellent. A quick victory would probably not be easy. As expected of a long-famous pirate, one who dared to usurp Tracis' position, he truly had some tricks up his sleeve. Vianata took a deep breath, her gaze fixed on Lehman King, who was sprawled on the ground, ready to launch an attack at any moment. No matter how powerful Lehman King was, he was still only a Sequence 6. She was not without a chance to fight. Moreover, Indoport was Vianata's territory now. Lehman King had no pirates or followers behind him to protect him. The more anxious one now was certainly Lehman, not Vianata. Indeed, Lehman King merely swayed slightly, then began to stand up from the ground. The other leather glove on his hand split open again, seemingly brewing some Viander ability. Seeing her opponent preparing to strike, Vianata naturally wouldn't fall behind. 6 flaming spears, carrying scorching wind pressure, shot straight towards Lehman, while she herself transformed into a jet of flame, closely following the spears, aiming for a decisive kill. However, Lehman King stretched out his left hand and pulled violently to the side. The 6 spears deflected 45 degrees in the air, hitting an adjacent wall, instantly sending bricks and stones flying and raising dust. This, of course, couldn't obscure Vianata's perception. After all, finding prey in chaotic situations was a required course for the hunter pathway. So, Vianata wasn't worried about a sneak attack from the opponent. She first stopped, then let a crimson ring of fire spread outwards from her body. This was a move prepared to prevent the opponent from launching a sneak attack when her flame sprint ended and she revealed herself. It could push enemies away. However, this sure-hit repelling fire ring didn't push anyone. The fire ring broke through the smoke and dust, leaving only a vague silhouette. He ran away. Vianata's mouth twitched. She realized that Lehman King was even more decisive than she had imagined. "We are just a Sequence 6 and a Sequence 7 here. You, a pirate general rumored to be comparable to a Sequence 5, just ran after a brief encounter with us. Is this even considered a pirate general?" Vianata said loudly to the empty street, unwilling to give up. This was her own taunting ability, not mere insults, and had a certain Viander-level effect of attracting aggro. However, even Vianata herself knew that this would have little effect now. Lehman King, a believer of the true creator, also wielding the sealed artifact of a rose bishop, a Viander who occasionally heard the true creator's ravings, surely had extremely high mental resistance. A mere provocation at the sequence 8 level was clearly insufficient to make him risk turning back directly. Indeed, the street remained empty. Debris knocked down by the battle rolled around on the street, making gurgling sounds. It wasn't until the hunter's danger premonition disappeared that Vianata realized that Shadow Lieutenant General had truly run away. How did you encounter this guy? Vianata carefully picked up the glove on the ground with the tip of her knife. Judging from Lehman King's attitude towards the other glove, this glove also seemed to be a mystical item. To avoid strange side effects, she didn't want to pick it up with her hands. He was Salvatore's contact person. After I killed Salvatore, I hid in the room to avoid drawing attention, but he suddenly showed up, seemingly wanting to exchange some information with Salvatore. I had no choice but to break the window and escape. Sophie answered truthfully, then asked curiously, "Were you following me from the beginning?" Vianata's expression became a little unnatural, and she changed the subject somewhat stiffly. "Salvatore. Is that Intis person on the list?" "That's right, a suspected true creator believer, a peripheral member of the Iron and Blood Cross Order." Sophie nodded. "I checked his room and found nothing that could serve as a clue. After all, he was a shadow ascetic." As she spoke, Sophie made an eating gesture, and Vianata immediately understood. Although shadow ascetics don't have the Rose Bishop's ability to control flesh and blood magic, they can't casually tear off a body organ to send information. Strictly speaking, it's not impossible, but without corresponding flesh and blood magic treatment, the torn-off part would leave a permanent disability, which even a later promotion to Rose Bishop couldn't fix. At most, they can unilaterally receive information from other Rose Bishops. Then, what about Salvatore's corpse? Vianata continued to ask. "Although it probably can't be communicated with anymore, I plan to arrange an autopsy for it later. We should be able to find something." Lehman King ate it directly. Sophie was helpless. The fact that Shadow Lieutenant General possessed the abilities of a Rose Bishop was indeed very troublesome. Whether for self-preservation, destroying evidence, or offense, Rose Bishop's performance was excellent, allowing this rising star pirate general to be powerful, at least in terms of personal strength, not much weaker than other lieutenant generals. "I see, then we can't force it. Let's go back first." Vianata was a little helpless. "At least your acting progress should be relatively smooth. There must be some good things." Sophie raised her head slightly. "Let's go back first. You'll be busy next." Vianata's expression was serious. Sophie's words weren't entirely a joke. After all, since Lehman King dared to sneak into Indo Port alone, it meant his fleet was not far from here. The last time pirates invaded a large city was when King of the Five Seas Nast reclaimed his earldom of White Maple, and that fief was an island isolated overseas. And now, after nearly a century, a mere Shadow Lieutenant General actually wanted to break this long untouched taboo and attack Indo Port, a former bridgehead city and important coastal trade center. Who gave him the courage? Vianata couldn't understand, and Miss Audrey's understanding of information in this area was also very limited, which made her feel a little irritable. As a conspirer, being able to only passively react to situations was a rather uncomfortable experience. If Adele were still around, things would be much simpler. At least there would be someone to take turns with me, Vianata thought to herself, while also feeling a little worried about Adele's condition. Nearly half a month had passed since the last telegram was received. During this time, Adele had not sent any news, and Vianata's telegrams to Adele had fallen on deaf ears. Although she repeatedly urged the relay station, the only message she received was that the telegraph lines along the way had not yet been repaired. Vianata was very annoyed by this but had no solution. If all lines were unusable, then how did Adele's telegram get through? However, thinking about these things now was clearly not helpful to the current situation, so Vianata forcibly cut off her thoughts and rushed towards the distant dock with Sophie. Dangerous Rock Street number 57, astrologer Sonia Moran, dressed in a light purple warlock robe and a matching pointed soft hat, was sipping from a gin bottle as usual. Around her were more than 20 cats, resting by the warm fireplace with her. Despite having formed a partnership with Vianata, her daily work hadn't changed much. She still ran her divination shop here during the day, only occasionally going to the Queen Island Company headquarters at the dock to report her work status. And the Beander materials Sophie had left here before, she had almost used them up during this time. This meant that Sonia would not be disturbed for a long time, which was indeed a good thing, allowing her enough time and energy to observe the changes of the star. However, just as she was about to cast aside all worldly distractions and enter a meditative state, the dilapidated wooden door was knocked upon once again. Sonia sighed, placed the teacup containing vanilla tea aside, and walked out of her room, casually responding, "Is that Sophie? I'm coming." Then, she opened the latch and subconsciously looked down, only to see a blue warlock robe and pale, bare feet. This body proportion clearly couldn't be Sophie's. Sonia looked up in surprise, and what met her eyes was a beautiful face with a hint of charm. Sonia had only seen this characteristic in one type of person: demoness. Sonia's expression immediately became serious. She quickly glanced around, and after finding no one, she quickly stepped aside, ushering the demoness into her room. Then Sonia reached out and grabbed at the air. The glittering planetary-shaped sequins hanging in the room began to spin, forming a unique barrier that isolated the inside from the outside. "Are you from the cult?" Only now did Sonia have time to ask. "That's right, let me introduce myself first. My name is Renala, known as the Full Moon Witch." The newcomer took off the large, pointed soft hat that evoked the deep, dark night sky and bowed slightly to Sonia. "I should have directly informed Miss CC, the highest administrator of this area, but she is currently not on the northern continent, so I can only ask you to continue with the plan." "The cult, what new developments are there?" Sonia asked cautiously. "With my current abilities, I may not be able to help." During this time, under the care and protection of the Queen Island Company, she had lived a very comfortable life, even somewhat forgetting that she was also a member of Theosophy Order. Everyone will encounter all sorts of troubles. Either you go looking for trouble, or trouble comes looking for you. Even if you keep hiding on dangerous Rock Street, they will come. Sophie's words from their first meeting suddenly surfaced in her mind, making Sonia a little lost in thought. Seemingly sensing Sonia's little thoughts, Renala chuckled with a hint of disdain. "Don't worry about those trivial matters. The cult is only here to inform you of some things and give you a task." The Fasak royal family previously held a sealed artifact of the Hunter Pathway Sequence 1. "Have you heard of this before?" Renala asked directly. Sonia nodded. After all, she had genuinely developed step by step from the Theosophy Order to the middle ranks. As neighboring pathways, the forces represented by the Hunter and Demoness pathways often had various entanglements. The opponent's top secret knowledge was naturally no secret among her Beander believers. Now, this sealed artifact has been lost. Before Sonia could explain further, Renala had already continued. The leader of the Fasak Empire was very vigilant. It wasn't until recently that we saw through his bluff and discovered the truth within the port. Shadow Lieutenant General and Undying King are both approaching here. It's clear they intend to scheme here for a while. Continuing to contend with them here will lead to unexpected situations. You mean the Fosak people failed in the process of contending for the Sequence 1 Beander characteristic? Sonia was somewhat stunned. In her mind, the Fosak people were all very capable fighters. Even if they had declined a bit in recent years, they shouldn't have had a Sequence 1 Beander characteristic stolen, right? If it was truly stolen, wouldn't the cult's actions be superfluous? Renala said, the cult is worried that the loss of the Fasak Empire's conqueror characteristic this time might be orchestrated by the Empire itself. If that is the case, then the cult's plans here must be adjusted. The Church once obtained a conqueror Beander characteristic from the Augustus family, and blasphemer Aemon attempted to steal this characteristic. However, later the Primordial One personally intervened, and that characteristic is now in the Primordial One's hands. But Aemon still managed to get a conqueror, and now that I think about it, that conqueror must have been obtained from the Einhorn family of the Fasak Empire. With these two Beander characteristics, if a uniqueness were added, then even the Primordial One would be threatened. The mastermind is Fosak itself. Sonia repeated in confusion, then she seemed to remember something. She subconsciously covered her mouth. Number way. That's right. Renala nodded. The current Fosak needs a true god to end the chaos within the country, no matter who it is. Chapter 363, Prelude to the Decisive Battle. At the same time, on the southern continent, Adele was sitting in a secret room within the Operations Command Center, with Gegran beside her. The two sat together on one side of a 2-meter-long table. Tracy had been politely asked to leave the room. After all, the upcoming discussion involved cooperation between the Essence faction, the kingdom, and the church. As Katarina's daughter, it was already merciful that she hadn't been dealt with, let alone being present at the meeting. Across from them sat Emlyn White, in a military uniform, sitting upright and serious, and an old man who looked like he was about to enter his coffin but exuded an inexplicable sense of majesty. He wore a thick ceremonial robe adorned with medals and sashes, and on his head was a tall triple crown, its jewels forming Oswald of Judgment, symbol, representing the Augustus family. His physique was not tall, but it appeared sturdy and substantial, not frail and weak like his aged appearance suggested. Of course, most importantly, he exuded a subtle, almost imperceptible aura of a superior, so much so that even Adele, Tracy, and even Emlyn White, who had broken through to the demigod level, dared not act presumptuously in front of this old man. Most of them could only cautiously stare at the tabletop, not even daring to exchange glances. His attire, appearance, and aura, all of these indicated the identity of this old man. He was Loan's protector. After the Night Emperor's demise in the War of the Four Emperors, he received the support of the seven deities, obtained the Night Emperor's Beander characteristic, successfully became a sequence one hand of order, and annihilated the Truncest family, establishing the Loan kingdom. He was the de facto supreme commander of the kingdom's garrison on the southern continent, the secret weapon used to counter the god-nurtured Suea, who believed in the mother tree of desire, the founder, William Augustus. His existence was originally solely to counter Suea, but ever since Suea began indiscriminately attacking the southern continent's army, he had to start participating in the actual operations of the army, making it easier for him to arrive at Suea's potential location at the first possible moment. Logistics were not originally his responsibility. The reason he specifically rushed to the rear this time was because Emlyn White had stated that a friendly angel was willing to provide assistance, which prompted him to secretly return. "I didn't expect it to be a demoness," William Augustus snorted. "However, I'm not surprised to see you here." Gegran's voice sounded quite cheerful, completely unaffected by William Augustus. "Our last cooperation wasn't very pleasant. What are your intentions this time?" William Augustus's expression was stern, radiating authority without anger. Adele was almost completely suppressed by his aura. This had nothing to do with standing, it was an innate aura that came from dwelling at a high level for a long time. "You can't just say that. Strictly speaking, we never cooperated with you." Gegran pulled out her pipe, began filling it with herbs in front of William Augustus, and replied distractedly. "It's similar to the Rose School of Thought's Indulgence faction and Temperance faction. One believes in the Mother Tree of Desire, the other in the Bound God. We believe in the City of Calamity. Those who cooperated with you before believed in the primordial demoness. It's the City of Calamity, not eternal calamity." William Augustus immediately seized upon the information revealed in Gegran's words. "In other words, the deity you believe in is not a true god." Since Emlyn and Adele were present, he didn't directly ask if they believed in the activated Sephira itself rather than the corresponding ancient deity. "If that's all you can understand, it doesn't affect our continued dialogue." Gegran nodded, lightly brushing past the topic despite William Augustus's firm attitude. "That's true, but you've left a rather poor impression on this country. If you want to seek cooperation, you'll have to offer more chips." William Augustus's gaze was sharp, and lightning seemed to flicker in his eyes. As a justiciar, even when asking for help, he would spare no effort to secure benefits. Thus, he directly used some of his abilities to try and pressure Gegran. "I never thought that you, a dignified hand of order, would haggle like a peddler. Is that why you designed such an unconventional currency system?" Gegran was completely unaffected. The two bolts of lightning in William Augustus's eyes seemed to have never appeared, flickering for an instant before vanishing. "The Essence faction doesn't have many members right now, so I'm probably the only enforcer available to you. If you insist, this child can barely count too." Lighting the spiritual herbs in her pipe with black fire, and exhaling a smoke ring under William Augustus's clearly displeased expression, Gegran said indifferently, "So, if you want to ask for an exorbitant price, feel free. We don't have anything more anyway." After saying that, seeing William Augustus's expression remain unmoved, Gegran smiled again, winked at William Augustus, and said, "Of course, if you were a few hundred years younger, I might be able to offer you other rewards. Adele, listening nearby, broke out in a cold sweat. She never imagined Gegran would dare to tease an angel who had lived for hundreds or thousands of years. Indeed, seduction and provocation shared common ground in some respects. However, for William Augustus, who had also lived for hundreds or thousands of years, such a provocation had as little effect as the mental pressure he had previously tested. He merely frowned and said, "That's fine, but she must participate in the war and act with my soldiers." In reality, William Augustus never intended to gain a significant advantage from Gegran. He was merely making an exorbitant demand earlier. After all, opportunities to extort an angel were rare. His ultimate goal was simply to bind both Adele and Gegran to the Loan Kingdom's war chariot. If he had demanded Adele's participation earlier, Gegran might not have agreed easily, but now, Gegran had just refused Augustus, so she theoretically wouldn't easily reject this compromise. But when dealing with a demoness, how many theoreticallys are there? As if seeing through William Augustus's thoughts, Gegran suddenly went against her usual demeanor. Her previous playful nonchalance completely vanished. She stared directly into his eyes, confronting this Sequence 1 terrestrial angel, and said word by word, "I refuse. Unless she can freely decide whether to participate in the war, and where, when, and how to participate, otherwise you will get nothing." Gegran was very firm, without the slightest unconscious guilt after just refusing the other party. "Either you negotiate a cooperation plan that I can accept right now, or we go our separate ways. You can deal with Sueya yourselves. As for whether the southern continent sinks, it has nothing to do with me." Adele and Emlyn sat on the side, their eyes fixed on the tabletop, completely daring not to intervene in the argument between these two. After all, both of these individuals possessed the ability to turn the entire Baron's port upside down. And neither Mr. Moon of the Tarot Club, who had just stepped into the demigod level, nor Miss Empress of the Tarot Club, who hadn't even touched the threshold of a demigod, dared to speak up now. Fortunately, the two angels' standoff lasted less than a minute before the atmosphere gradually softened. Finally, William Augustus nodded expressionlessly and said, "I understand. I can agree to your terms, but the specific battle plan will be decided by us. Wouldn't it have been fine if you had just done that earlier?" Gegran gently curved her lips, revealing a victorious smile, and the tense atmosphere immediately relaxed. "Lieutenant General White, go to the General Staff and formulate the next offensive plan. Before the end of March, I want the banner of the Sword of Judgment planted on the city walls of Verdant." William Augustus snorted, ignoring Gegran's boastful words, and instead directly commanded Emlyn. "Yes, Your Excellency, Protector." Emlyn dared not delay, quickly responding loudly, "What combat forces can we mobilize this time?" The Loan Kingdom had many experts deployed on the southern continent. Just among the Earth Mother's Blessed, there were Father Utfsky and Sister Vesper, Shaman King Emlyn, Nightwatcher Leonard, Sword of the Goddess Crestet Sazima, and War Bishop Avila, all demigod-level powerhouses, at least high-ranking deacons within their respective churches. However, most of them were on rotation or stationed in various locations, rarely appearing together. "How many can be mobilized?" William Augustus repeated Emlyn's question, seemingly finding it incredible that he would ask it. "All of them, of course," William Augustus emphasized, "all of them." Hagati grassland border, Loan Army's outpost. Inside a dilapidated canvas tent, Leonard and Lieutenant General Avila, who had long, fiery red hair, stood across a table, discussing the unfolding situation. "I've said it before, now is a good opportunity for a counterattack." The somewhat frivolous Avila said impatiently, "Their strength was originally inferior to ours. Now, with Sueya's help, they've regained some ground, but they've also overextended their own front lines. We overestimated our own strength because we were too successful in the early stages, leading to Sueya cutting us off," Avila asserted decisively. "Although we've suffered a setback, we've now consolidated our front lines, concentrating our forces, which is suitable for a decisive battle. Given the current state of the soldiers, a failed general offensive would likely turn into a rout," Leonard tried to object. "Not everyone's deployments are as intact as yours. When the abomination Sueya ambushed the Loan army, all the senior generals' subordinates suffered significant casualties. Most were left with permanent disabilities, the lucky ones could undergo surgical removal, while the unfortunate ones had to live with deformed bodies. However, only Avila's deployment remained remarkably intact, with casualties even controlled below 5%. Pale's Zoroaster speculated that it might be because Avila, as the commander, had shared his power with his subordinates, forcibly raising their standing and mitigating the damage they sustained from directly facing a deity. Then go ask yourself why you didn't bring your troops back intact, Avila waved his hand. However, considering your unit's casualty rate, if you don't wish to participate, you can take your wounded and remnants to defend our main camp. It won't be too late to give me orders once you receive the general offensive command. Leonard didn't want to get entangled, so he just dropped a remark and then left the room in a hurry. This guy, even though we are both lieutenant generals, and he dares not reveal his true strength, I am always invisibly suppressed by him. After walking a distance, Leonard angrily kicked the wooden fence of the camp, feeling a bit frustrated. You forgot what I told you again. When talking to him, always remind yourself not to get angry. Pale's Zoroaster's voice sounded in Leonard's ear. When it comes to provocation, he is definitely the patriarch of hunters. If you truly get angry because of his words, even your life will be affected. Single quote. Why do I feel like your tone is a bit schadenfreude? Leonard asked hesitantly. See, that's the effect, Pale's Zoroaster sneered. Everyone who has interacted with him inevitably becomes irritable and prone to anger. Even if it's harmless in the short term, it could lead to more serious consequences in the future, even causing one to make substandard judgments. Then, what do you think about his actions during this period? Leonard took a deep breath, confirming repeatedly that his mindset had become calm, before asking Pales, I understand his intention. Previously, he followed the main forces, seeking stability, but recently he has suddenly become aggressive, actively seeking opportunities for engagement. It's simple. Either his provocations backfired on him, or he has obtained what he was pursuing and just needs to find an opportunity to digest it. Pale's Zoroaster said, however, if it's the latter, his actions are too quick. As far as I know, he couldn't have acquired a sequence 1 Beander characteristic long ago. To want to fight a decisive battle on the southern continent so quickly, how would he then strive to become a true god? Would he start another war somewhere else? If so, it would be strange if the 7 deities didn't directly crush him. Pales explained patiently. Personally, I hope it's the former possibility. Leonard smiled bitterly, feeling a bit helpless. It's really difficult to make me restrain this existence. However, if he really starts to mobilize troops for a general offensive, then I should have a chance to participate in the next tarot club without being discovered. Leonard thought to himself, looking forward to the next tarot club. Chapter 364, Tracing the Source of the Southern Continent. The northern part of Baron's Port, in the relatively safe dock district. The scene here hadn't changed much since Adele left 2 weeks ago. The dark red patterns on the trapezoidal earthen and stone city wall, 4 or 5 meters high, were still clearly visible. Crossing the city wall, one could immediately see the pyramid temple located in the center of the distant southern district, and the 4 chimneys of the surrounding metallurgical plants. The distances between them were specific spiritual numbers, used to prevent the temple, which once worshipped death, from undergoing mutation. The city wall was still the same city wall, but this time, the battlements held more than double the usual number of guards. Several local chiefs who obeyed the kingdom were directing their slaves to set up old mortars on the top of the wall. However, the muzzles of these mortars were not all facing outside the city, a considerable portion was aimed inward. This was to prevent traitors from charging the city gates during the war that might soon spread here. Though it sounds incredible, this is common among the indigenous soldiers of the southern continent, whose will to fight is generally weak. When Lowen and the colonies in the southern continent first entered the trench warfare stage, the casualties on both sides were very limited, leading to the absurd phenomenon where, in some colonial slave regiments, more people were executed by the military judge than were killed in battle. Has the date for the final decisive battle been set? Tracis' lips moved slightly as she secretly communicated with Adele beside her. Since Gegran proposed that Adele had the right to decide whether or not to participate in the war, Adele and Tracy were intentionally or unintentionally excluded from the seminar discussing the battle plan, which is why they now had time to wander around. It should be this month. I estimate full mobilization will begin tomorrow at the latest. Adele also answered softly in the same manner, which is a common way to conduct private communication in public. So, what are we going to do this time? Tracy rubbed her hands, feeling slightly excited. The previous haul was truly substantial. Although she, with her rich pirate experience, knew that such opportunities were rare, that batch of precious artwork significantly boosted her enthusiasm for work. I'm afraid it's unlikely we'll continue doing easy work. Just by looking at Tracy's expression, Adele guessed what she wanted to do and preemptively poured cold water on the idea. After all, we are external personnel temporarily transferred here. If a project is truly profitable, even if it's not hugely lucrative, the military will replace us with their own direct subordinates sooner or later. You have a point. Tracy was slightly dejected. So what should we do? The easiest thing would be to use our powerful firepower to provide support for the troops responsible for raiding Elise. All we have to do is stand on the ship, aim at the target, and fire all the shells. Adele sighed. This is also an excellent way to utilize the advantage of the ironclad ship. However, it's hard to say whether the military personnel will allow us to proceed so smoothly. Adele, an assassin by trade, had a natural aversion and distance from the military, which made her uninterested in the general staff's operational plans. Just keep an eye on the situation when the time comes. If things go wrong, no ship can outrun the snow wind. Adele smiled easily. Anyway, I'm not ready to sacrifice my life just yet to gain believers for other deities. You certainly dare to say that. Seeing Adele's clear attitude, Tracy also relaxed, a weight finally lifted from her heart. She had originally worried that Adele and Gegran might make some compromises to reach an agreement with the military, and such compromises might very well involve her, a former Orthodox member of the demonist sect. Now it seemed Tracy had simply been overthinking things. But more than all this, I am worried about the state of this city. Adele's expression carried deep anxiety, far removed from the clear state of detachment she exhibited when facing William Augustus previously. Are you talking about those spires? Tracy raised an eyebrow and followed Adele's gaze, seeing the 4 spire-like chimneys, which were rumored to contain some form of mysticism ritual magic knowledge. Exactly. I previously encountered a mutated death family priest nearby, and in our last communication before he lost his mind, he showed exceptional reverence and importance toward those spires. This is something that absolutely cannot be simply explained by a worker's love for their factory. It was closer to a fanaticism I couldn't comprehend. Recalling the priest who had consumed ayahuasca, Adele's expression became complicated. It was since encountering that priest that the issues around Adele began to shift from minor matters solvable with combat skills, a revolver, and Beander abilities, to events that were profound and mysterious, where recognizing the problem was harder than solving it, leaving Adele mentally exhausted. I wanted to thoroughly investigate this at the time, but the very next day I received an urgent order to go to sea. Adele spread her hands. After returning, I kept wanting to ask Vice Admiral White, but he has been mentally exhausted just dealing with the founder, William Augustus recently. I tried to rush him several times, but he had no updates. Speaking of this, Adele suddenly remembered something and asked Tracy. You've been to the southern continent several times before. You should have a thorough understanding of the local customs, especially concerning mysterious incidents. Do you have any reference materials? Tracy was stunned for a moment, but quickly recovered and nodded gently. If you need other information, like that ayahuasca, I don't know much more than you do. In fact, because Mother was not a demoness skilled in these obscure black magic arts, I have even less experience in similar areas than you do, having been taught by Gegran. However, if all you want to know is the history of the southern continent colonies, I can certainly tell you all about it. But how much of that information will be useful is something you'll have to judge for yourself. Tracy glanced at Adele, and seeing that Adele had no objection, she began to narrate slowly, telling the story of the southern continent starting from the appearance of the earliest colonists. Some readers commented on the previous 2 chapters that 4,000 characters per chapter felt a bit strange, and they wanted to switch back to 2,000 characters per chapter. Since the recent average subscription rate is neither high nor low, I don't really need to use long chapters to boost the average subscription anymore. I'll switch back to 2,000 characters per chapter for a while. Chapter 365, Some Legends. First of all, I'm not a professional historian of the southern continent. My knowledge of the southern continent is limited to what I've learned from the oral accounts of the southern continent slaves have captured and some information passed down by word of mouth within the sect. Tracy pondered for a moment before speaking. I'm just using it as a reference. Adele nodded, indicating that she didn't mind. After all, having dealt with high-sequence beings extensively, Adele had adapted to many of their enigmatic ways of speaking. Even if Trass's explanation was vague, she had other ways to verify it. Of course, high-sequence beings often didn't deliberately conceal information, rather, many prerequisites were considered common knowledge in their eyes and didn't require extra explanation. Actively asking wasn't a wise choice. Hearing Adele's affirmative reply, Tracy took a sip of the Tiana fruit juice she had just bought from a roadside stall, then began to organize her thoughts and describe. You probably wouldn't want to hear about prehistoric times, since this isn't an archaeological paper. So, I think it's better to start with the War of the Four Emperors. How much do you know about the War of the Four Emperors? Before she began, Tracy asked first, to avoid spending a long time explaining things Adele already knew. I don't know much, only that it was a war fought to compete for believers. Adele tried to recall. The six gods at the time were dissatisfied with Emperor Solomon monopolizing all faith, so they launched a first war of faith, conspired to kill the then Black Emperor Solomon, and instructed the two consuls at the time to divide his remains. Their names were Tutor and Truncest, who later became the Blood Emperor and the Night Emperor. Later, Solomon was reborn as the Black Emperor through his own mysterious sequence characteristics, reclaiming his authority. The six gods at the time supported the Night Emperor, shifting to the Justiciar pathway. With no other path, Alistair Tutor, with the help of several kings of angels, conspired to harm the angels of the Sauron, Einhorn, and Medici families who then controlled the Hunter pathway, forcefully shifting to the non-adjacent Red Priest pathway, becoming the later, Blood Emperor. The Black Emperor Solomon, the Night Emperor Truncest, the Blood Emperor Alistair Tutor, and the Underworld Emperor Salinger waged a decades-long war on the northern continent. Ultimately, the Black Emperor and the Blood Emperor fell, the Night Emperor occupied the northern continent and established the Truncest Empire, while the Underworld Emperor gained the greatest advantage, allowing the Balaam Empire to unify the entire southern continent. Adele finished in one breath, waiting for Tracy to add more. You know quite a bit. Tracy listened quietly, let out a breath, and chuckled softly, then I'll pick up from there. She pushed away a strand of unruly hair that had fallen to her lips and began to narrate. About 100 years after the establishment of the Truncest Empire, Death had already unified the entire southern continent, but also went half-mad for some reason, leading him to support Cheek's advancement to primordial demoness, ushering in the prologue of the Pale Disaster on the northern continent. Before that, the southern continent only had the Balaam Empire, managed by Death's child, the Death Consul. And at that time, the primordial demoness was just an angel under Death, only gaining the chance to become a true god during the Pale Disaster. Tracy gave a self-deprecating smile, as if she felt it was an offense for her, a former Orthodox member of the demoness sect, to speak of the primordial demoness in such a tone. And this information can be seen in many relief murals on the southern continent. Back then, they weren't like the current seven gods, who, to prevent the faith of the populace from shifting with the quality of their effigies, declared that they only had one image, their holy emblem. So, we can see in many murals that the primordial demoness frequently appeared as the second in command at Death's banquets. However, neither the Underworld Emperor nor the primordial demoness at the time expected that the half-mad Underworld Emperor could force the seven discordant deities to fully unite for the first time, killing the Underworld Emperor. The primordial demoness hid deep within the astral world, and Death's monopoly on faith in the southern continent was thus lost. Hearing this, Adele's expression gradually became serious, because she knew it was getting close to the modern era. In the early 5th epoch, the bound god appeared and created the Rose School of Thought, establishing the Highland Kingdom with the school as its core. This kingdom lasted until 428 CE, when the abomination Suea was born, disrupting the balance of the Rose School of Thought. The Indulgence faction overwhelmed the Temperance faction, and the Highland Kingdom soon fell. Tracy continued to explain. This knowledge, which was priceless outside, was akin to scripture for members of the demoness sect, freely usable during proselytization. After all, there was much cooperation between the demonesses and the mystical factions of the Death Pathway, so it was natural for them to know some of each other's secrets. From 621 to 642 of the 5th epoch, the 20 Years' War broke out between Loan and Fosak. Loan lost Sunia Island, and its influence on the southern continent almost vanished, until it later defeated Intis in the White Rose War, thereby controlling the current East Balam region. Therefore, religious beliefs in the southern continent are actually quite complex. Not only does it retain various beliefs in nature spirits and ancestral spirits, but there are also believers of the primordial demoness, death, the god of steam and machinery, the bound god, the mother tree of desire, the god of knowledge and wisdom, and various other deities. Among them, believers of the god of knowledge and wisdom and the god of steam and machinery are particularly numerous. Believers of the god of steam and machinery are numerous because this place was once colonized by Intis, so why do believers of the god of knowledge and wisdom still account for such a large proportion here? Adele asked, puzzled. The cause was the War of Perjury in 738. Tracy explained unhurriedly, Fenaport originally worshipped both the earth and knowledge deities. However, incited by Loan and Intis, a war broke out under the pretext of protecting religious freedom, leading to the independence of countries like Limburg, Masik, and Sagar, located at the borders of Loan and Fenaport, and Intis and Fenaport, who then worshipped the god of knowledge and wisdom. Some of these believers were sent by Intis to Limburg and other places to stir up emotions, but these knowledge believers did not stay in Limburg because there was no longer a place for them. In the end, Intis secretly relocated them to its southern continent colonies, leaving a profound impact here. Most of the anomalies you see here are very likely related to them. Chapter 366, Transfer Order. Is that so? So, this place has been influenced by Intis ever since the War of the Oathbreakers began. Adele listened intently to Trasis' narration, then spoke to confirm. That's right. Therefore, it's natural for traces of the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom to appear here. To thoroughly investigate it from beginning to end would be an enormous undertaking. At least at this critical juncture of the decisive battle, the military would find it difficult to spare enough manpower to deal with this side. Tracy explained, a considerable portion of the original culture in the southern continent region is considered bloody, barbaric, and even anti-human in the eyes of people today. So, after occupying this place, Loan, Intis, and Fosak all implemented rather crude methods of cultural input, which allowed East Balam's order to largely recover. As for West Balam, it's secretly controlled by the Indulgence faction, and its cultural origins are even more complex. To investigate potential contingencies left behind centuries ago, it might be less costly to patiently wait for them to erupt on their own and then respond. Adele fell silent for a moment, unsure how to respond, because she knew Tracy was telling the truth. At this critical moment, the military would find it difficult to spare energy for more arrangements or to investigate hidden dangers that hadn't yet been exposed. All we can do now is wait for the military's next arrangements. Tracy finished drinking the Tiana fruit juice in her hand, shrugging as she spoke. Adele nodded, then looked at the 4 tall towers in the southern district in the distance, reluctantly turned, and returned to naval headquarters with Tracy. Unlike their previous hurried arrival, the two now had formal positions. Emmeline had even specially prepared independent offices for them. Although not too large, the emphasis was on independence, unlike the semi-enclosed, row-style offices of other military officers, and they were even equipped with dedicated communicators for delivering messages. As soon as Adele returned to her office, which she was visiting for the first time, she saw several documents on her desk, seemingly just retrieved from the operations briefing room by her secretary, sealed tightly with wax. It's worth noting that due to limited manpower, this secretary was simultaneously responsible for the reception of Adele, Tracy, and Wendy. The pomp of the Loan military was evident. Even with insufficient personnel, they still tried to maintain a certain level of sophistication in details. It really feels like an office worker clocking in and out every day. Adele chuckled self-deprecatingly, opening the document sealed with wax. If such a job had been offered to her before she became a Beander, she probably wouldn't have mingled in the lower streets, wouldn't have met Miss Audrey, and wouldn't have become a Beander under her secret arrangements. Miss Audrey had candidly revealed the truth of the situation after Adele asked about these matters. When she chose Altair as a subordinate, she truly hadn't given any extra thought. She simply observed in secret, selecting some bold and meticulous young people in Ahawa County whom she believed had relevant abilities, both male and female, with identities ranging from minor nobility in the upper class to paupers in the lower society. Then, through layers of screening, she arranged a series of tasks, observing the candidate's completion to gradually narrow down the pool of candidates, eventually locking onto Altair and secretly guiding him to consume that assassin Beander characteristic. And Miss Audrey's explanation for this was, perhaps it sounds very childish to you now, but my opponent is an angel of the same pathway. He must have spent much longer at the saint level than I have. He can think of anything I can think of. At the time, your qualities were neither the best nor the worst, but that's what I needed. After all, if I can choose you as a contact person because of some unique qualities you possess, then he can also deduce the qualities a contact person might have and trace it back to you. When she said this, Miss Audrey smiled slightly. This was the first time Adele had seen her smile in the real world when they met as Tarot Club members. Perhaps saying this might dampen your enthusiasm, but I chose you not because you can do certain things or want to do certain things, but precisely because you have no particular goals, which makes it easier for you to do what I hope you will do. After everything is over, you will naturally have the ability to do most of what you want to do, but before that, please continue to trust my arrangements, just for the sake of those who were like you before. Even now, recalling Miss Audrey's description, Adele was filled with emotion. After all, with even a slight change, she might now be exhausting her energy in a factory in the East Borough, perhaps dying silently like the tens of thousands in the Angel's Fall incident. Shaking her head, casting off useless thoughts, Adele tore open the document in her hand and began to read. However, she only read a few lines before her brows furrowed slightly. Why am I being transferred from the snow wind? Adele's pencil subconsciously tapped the desk. This transfer order made her feel quite uncomfortable. The report stated that, after consideration by the Operations Command, deploying 2 demonesses on the same ship would, to some extent, lead to a waste of combat power. Furthermore, Adele was accompanied by a group of demonesses under Gegran's command. If all of them were deployed on the Snow Wind, there would be 6 demonesses on board, exceeding the limit for Beyonders deployed on an ironclad ship. Therefore, the military temporarily decided to reorganize the remaining ordinary warships within the harbor, then disperse the demonesses and assign them to 5 different ships. The Snow Wind would then be taken over by Tracy and Wendy. This transfer order made Adele very unhappy. She felt offended. However, the reasons provided by the military were indeed very compelling, so compelling that Adele had almost no grounds to refute them. After all, when the ironclad ship was purchased in the name of the Hall family's partner, it was specifically stipulated that the kingdom's military could requisition the ship at any time they deemed necessary. Otherwise, even with Miss Audrey's influence, the procedures would not have been so easy to handle. If Adele were to renege on this agreement now, it would involve Miss Hall as a guarantor. At this critical juncture, Adele did not want to involve her. After all, Miss Audrey was currently playing a game with Hermes. Every time she made a move, it would leave an unusual trace in her network of interpersonal relationships, and such traces would be captured by Hermes, putting her in a passive position. There's no point thinking about these things now, it's better to first look at my specific assignment. Adele sighed, turning the page of the report. Chapter 367, Open Conspiracy. Due to the generally protracted and verbose report format of the Loan military, official pre-war deployment orders are usually divided into 2 parts. The first part explains the reasons for the deployment and the personnel involved, and the second part introduces the destination and operational plan. Adele opened the second half of the report. This one was much thicker than the previous one, and Adele took quite a while to read through it. However, after reading the new deployment order, Adele not only did not feel that her situation had improved, but became even more confused. They're not sending me to the front lines, but instead letting me investigate what I wanted to investigate. Adele muttered to herself, completely baffled by the military's arrangements. The report mentioned that since this was a colonial region with a complex religious composition, and given the previous incident of mutated priests, coupled with the various events the Snow Wind encountered at sea, the High Command believed that after the expedition, someone was needed to stabilize the rear. Because Adele had previously shown interest in ayahuasca and the mutated priest incident, To resolve this matter, the military decided to keep Adele alone at the rear base, to cooperate with the local police department, and conduct a thorough investigation into the ayahuasca incident starting from its distribution channels. Taken individually, these deployment orders had very sufficient reasons. War indeed required a stable rear, and beyonders like demonesses were indeed not suitable for cooperating within the same pathway. But put together, it made one feel awkward no matter how one thought about it. Although there must be reasons in this regard, the true reason definitely isn't this. Adele subconsciously touched her earlobe. The military's approach was as crude as ever. For certain unspeakable reasons, I want to arrange something for you, so I'll just find a reasonable excuse to arrange it. It's best if you don't discover this disguise, and if you do, it's best to pretend you didn't. Anyway, the military's decision has been made. How about I go see Tracis' reaction first? Adele made up her mind, walked out of her room to Tracis, knocked on the door, and found it unlocked. Adele pushed the door open and found Tracy staring blankly at her own deployment order. Have you received your next combat mission? Adele's expression was normal as she greeted Tracy. Yes, I'm to command the ironclad ship to exert pressure on Elise and intercept ships attempting to leave Elise. Tracy nodded in response, but Adele always felt that her confidence was somewhat lacking. It seems this deployment order wasn't mistaken. Adele nodded. My order requires me to investigate the ayahuasca matter in the rear, far from the front lines. Tracis' expression was a bit awkward. After all, she had just finished analyzing with Adele that the military might not have the capability to thoroughly investigate some historical issues in the southern continent while simultaneously fighting a decisive battle, and then the military transferred Adele. Adele secretly observed Tracy and noticed her eyes darting away. Combining this with her previous behavior, Adele had a vague guess in her heart. She knew I would be transferred before, but didn't know I would be directly transferred to the rear. Who told her? Other people in the military. Thinking of this, Adele suddenly realized something. Tracy didn't seem as helpless as she appeared. She herself had cooperated with some people from the royal family and the military before, and it was highly likely she still maintained some connections. And now, the kingdom could completely use these connections to leak some information to Tracy in advance. This signal represented many things. Although the kingdom was currently cooperating with the Essence faction of the Demonist sect, it didn't mean that the kingdom truly intended to put all its eggs in the Essence faction's basket. The Loan royal family, which controlled the Justiciar pathway, always liked to create divisions to profit from them, whether dealing with foreign enemies or teammates. During the oath-breaking war, Loan gained most of the benefits by dividing Fenaport. By giving allies different levels of benefits to create estrangement between them, thereby causing division, and then maintaining the balance between these two parts, ultimately profiting from both sides. This method was as natural as breathing for William Augustus, who was once a sequence 2 balancer. Now, these two factions were the Essence faction and the True God faction. The Essence faction had the support of the angel Gegran. Although Tracy was backed by the True God faction, it was difficult for her to gain support from them. So the kingdom would naturally make good use of Tracy, providing a certain level of support to enable Tracy to suppress Adele without Gegran's interference. This kind of support naturally wouldn't be too obvious, but the current deployment order was indeed a method. Tracy, at the front lines, riding the coattails of the general offensive, could naturally reap war dividends and even potentially be promoted to a demigod with the kingdom's support. The ritual requirements could be met in the hostile cities of West Balam. As for Adele, she was assigned to the rear to investigate a highly involved cold case. Forget these few short days, even if she investigated until the end of days, she might not be able to sort out the complex situation in the rear. Her merits would likely fall far behind Tracis. Thinking of this, Adele glanced at Tracy again, finding her expression unusually flustered. She had originally wanted to say something, but after opening her mouth, she gave up. Adele sighed inwardly, knowing that this was inevitable. The military arranging such tasks wouldn't care what you thought. These were all open conspiracies, even if you knew the intricacies, even if both sides had an open and honest discussion, as long as there were indeed differences in stance. Under the military's deliberate differential treatment, two factions that could be balanced would still form. Tracy had probably already figured out the intricacies, but the problem now was that if she accepted the deployment order, she would offend the Essence faction. If she didn't accept it, she would offend both sides, practically forcing Tracy to take office. The demoness who created strife ultimately couldn't transcend strife. Having understood the reasoning, Adele no longer dwelled on it. After changing the subject and exchanging a few simple pleasantries with Tracy, she pushed the door open and left. With the military's former balancer Angel continuously fanning the flames between the two sides, Adele didn't think she could maintain their relationship well. This problem could actually be solved if one side was willing to suffer a loss, but this incident was not accidental. The founder, William Augustus, could create a conflict once and could create it a second time, until one side could no longer solve the problem by suffering losses. As for other solutions, perhaps they could only be resolved after Adele completed her mission in the southern continent and returned to Indo-Port. Before that, all Adele could do was wait. Chapter 368, Gathering Information. Having clarified what she needed to do, Adele didn't want to waste any more time. She left the Navy headquarters building, intending to go to the docks to retrieve the items she had left on the ship. When she and Tracy previously went hunting the lion-headed serpent, they only took minimal luggage. Most of Adele's personal belongings were still on the ship, making her office seem a little empty now. In reality, she could have simply ordered her secretary to arrange for someone to bring her things, but she wasn't used to giving commands, lagging behind even Vianata, who had only managed the Queen Island Company for a month. It wasn't until her carriage stopped outside a bar at the port that Adele realized she hadn't needed to make this trip at all. I really am not suited to be a high-ranking official. Adele gave a self-deprecating smile, hesitated briefly, and decided not to waste the trip she had already made, opting to find something to do first. Soon, Adele, carrying a small canvas bag containing her revolver and a mystical item, and wearing a small black soft hat, entered a small tavern in the dock district from a relatively better neighborhood. She planned to investigate here first, to see if she could get the information she wanted about ayahuasca from the bartender. The bar had just opened at this time. There were hardly any drunkards, only dock workers busy nearby who would come in for a simple substitute meal. Adele was dressed rather conservatively and plainly today, and by deliberately controlling her attractiveness to the opposite sex, she didn't cause too much of a stir. Blending into the crowd, she bought an oatmeal bread sandwich with pork sausage and a glass of lemonade for 10 pence, which made her look quite wealthy. Due to the Loan garrison, the Loan pound system was quite prevalent here and served as hard currency. The reason she ordered lemonade instead of South Wales beer or hot milk was entirely thanks to Frank Lee, who had given Adele a physiological aversion to both beer and milk. After slowly filling her stomach, Adele looked at the bartender. "Are there any new rumors lately?" She planned to start with the well-informed bartender. The bartender glanced at her and chuckled. "There are all sorts of new rumors here every day. If you don't specify what kind of information you want, the only free news I can share is that Mimosa has recently gotten a few more attractive young ladies." Mimosa seemed to be a pleasure establishment here. Tisk, this is why I've always disliked dealing with these bartenders since advancing to demoness. They certainly know a lot of information thanks to their position, but they are too vulgar and lack basic courtesy, which makes me feel physically uncomfortable. Adele complained inwardly, but her expression remained unchanged as she picked up her cup, took a sip, and waited for the bartender to continue. Stared at by Adele's pure black eyes, the bartender felt an inexplicable chill. He couldn't help but glance back at Adele unnaturally, swallowing hard. "If you just want a general overview of recent news, 10 pence. The bartender subconsciously quoted a price far lower than his usual asking rate. "That's very fair. I thought I would have to pressure him a bit more before he talked." Adele smiled slightly, retracting a bit of her charm ability, allowing the unnatural flush on the bartender's face to gradually subside. She rummaged casually in her small bag, pulled out a 1 sol paper note, and pushed it toward the bartender. "Keep the change, please tell me the details." "Yes, ma'am." The bartender hastily pocketed the paper note, set down the cup he was holding, draped a rag, it was hard to tell which was dirtier, the rag or the cup, over his noticeably hairy wrist, and began to speak to Adele. "If you're talking about the biggest recent event, it's probably the military's latest movements, right? Rumor has it that the front line suffered a defeat a while ago, and everyone says the military is trying to find a way to regain face. The bartender, speaking as if he wished for chaos, said, "Many people are saying the military is likely going to launch a strong frontal assault along the scorched Hagati grassland. The resistance army is also busy preparing their defenses, so it looks like something big is about to happen. So the plan being leaked is a frontal assault. It seems Loan's intelligence agencies have started operating. If what the bartender described is true, it has probably achieved a decent effect. Whether the people from the Rose School of Thought will be fooled depends on luck." Adele, who knew that the Loan military's focus was not on the southern front but on Elise in the eastern front, nodded inwardly, then nodded to the bartender. "I've heard about that, but I don't care about the affairs of those officials. Tell me something else." She didn't want to expose her identity or what exactly she was investigating, so she avoided asking pointed questions, instead looking for clues among the recent rumors. "Other things." The bartender first looked around to ensure no one was eavesdropping before cautiously speaking to Adele. "Recently, it seems a new small religious group has emerged, and its influence among the common people is quite significant." "Oh." Adele raised an eyebrow curiously. "Tell me about it." "This small group is very strange. Although they have their own totem and worship higher wisdom, they hope to achieve physical and mental liberation and enter the kingdom of God for eternal happiness by pursuing the legendary apocalypse." The bartender said with some disdain, "The reason they grew so quickly is simple. Other religions preach that their followers will find happiness after death, but this group directly claims that the apocalypse will arrive within 2 years. At that time, everyone who worships their totem can enter the paradise promised in their doctrine. Aren't they afraid of overpromising? If people don't enter paradise after 2 years, let's see what they'll do then." The bartender commented, "But I figure the founders of this organization will just make a quick buck and leave. Who cares about 2 years from now? By then, they'll have probably run off. Is it really that simple?" After listening to the bartender, Adele became somewhat suspicious. The 2-year timeframe is too ambiguous. It aligns roughly with the accelerated timeline of the apocalypse. If they just wanted to make a quick profit and run, 2 years is actually a bit too long. After all, once a group reaches a certain scale, it's impossible not to attract the attention of official beyonders. If they only wanted to use religion as a pretense for fraud, they wouldn't need to wait this long. They could fleece the savings of those who weren't wealthy in just a month. Chapter 369, The Smuggler. I'm aware of this matter now." After listening to the bartender's account, Adele didn't comment, but simply continued to ask the bartender if he had any new information. Persistent questioning on a single topic was clearly useless except for exposing her purpose. Furthermore, although the information held by a bartender was varied, it lacked depth, consisting mostly of scattered news overheard from customers, only providing a basic direction for subsequent investigation. At the very least, after talking with the bartender, Adele mentally raised the priority of this religious organization. The doctrine aimed at pursuing knowledge certainly sounded like a hidden move arranged by the God of Knowledge and Wisdom's denomination. However, the lack of a clear object of worship made Adele hesitant to confirm. Such vague and highly divergent descriptions not only fail to help stabilize the God of Knowledge and Wisdom, but also dilute the effect of other anchors on the God of Knowledge and Wisdom's self-positioning. During the Tarot Club, Mr. Hanged Man once mentioned that the image of a deity itself is influenced to some extent by the unified thoughts of the believers. To put it radically, if all believers believe the deity's image is that of a young girl in a maid outfit, then their mythical creature form will show a tendency to develop towards this image. Although they can indeed resist this tendency, the anchor would then lose its meaning. Even if people do not intentionally distort the deity's image, statues and portraits of deities in daily life often deviate significantly from the original due to differences in craftsmanship, which will eventually cause an impact over time. Therefore, the general consensus among the 7 great churches is that true gods do not leave behind idols, but only exist symbolically in the lives of their believers, guiding all the believers' anchors to the deity's holy emblem, and then transferring them to the deity themselves through the mysticism connection between the holy emblem and the deity. Is there any other news? Adele handed the empty glass back to the bartender, and at the same time took out a 1 sol bill and passed it over, signaling the bartender to continue speaking and to refill her drink. Besides that, there really hasn't been anything major. The bartender scratched his head, took a few shriveled lemons from under the counter and threw them into the mixer, grinding his teeth as he cranked the handle. If I had to say, a while ago, a group of merchants seemed to have smuggled a large batch of medicinal herbs, including 9 joint grass and dead vine, likely acquired from the local natives. I clearly warned him that things were tense lately and he shouldn't sell addictive substances, but he insisted on selling the goods he had first. Now I don't know where he went to sell them. The bartender took ice cubes from the insulated box, dropped them into the glass, and handed it over. Want to try some? Let me warn you, I don't recommend touching that stuff. That's none of your concern. Adele didn't respond to the bartender's question, but continued to press. What is the merchant's name, and where do you think he might have gone? His name is Nivaldo Batista Santana. He's a local from the southern continent. You just need to ask around at other bars if anyone has heard of Santana. Due to the affinity characteristic inherent to Adele's demoness pathway, ordinary people like the bartender were completely incapable of resisting. He subconsciously assumed Adele was looking for Santana to buy goods and immediately gave Adele the relevant information. Very good, thank you for the information. Adele smiled brightly one last time and pulled out a third 1 sol bill from her pocket, handing it to the bartender. Remember to keep this confidential. Adele slowly stood up and picked up the small bag she had placed beside her. Goodbye, come again. The bartender greeted her enthusiastically, only stopping once Adele had completely disappeared from his sight. Adele left the bar and walked towards the Snow Wind, moored at the dock. The 1 sol she gave the bartender wasn't hush money. After all, if he could sell information to her for 1 sol, he could just as easily sell her information to others for 1 sol or more. She gave the bartender 1 sol not to truly silence him, but simply so that if the information he leaked caused her trouble, she would have a reason when settling the score with him. After becoming a demoness, Adele intentionally maintained this habit, often proactively setting limits for herself when making decisions involving assassination or other life and death matters. When acting against ordinary people caught up in the struggle between the sides of mysticism, she forced herself to abide by these rules. Perhaps others might see this as hypocrisy, but maintaining her humanity in this way was genuinely helpful. Adele could feel that since she started following similar rules, issues like the spiritual fluctuations that often occurred when she first advanced to Sequence 6 rarely appeared anymore. In the world of Beyonders, no trifle is small enough that it won't affect the digestion of the potion. The accumulation of any small matter often ultimately leads to a Beyonder's mental state or even the degree of mutation. Stepping onto the deck, Adele saw Wendy and Constantine walking arm in arm, laughing and chatting as they came up from the lower hold. Today, Wendy was not wearing the non-woven work clothes she almost always wore, but had changed into a brown women's trench coat, marked with coffee-colored lines forming a checked pattern, which suited her eyes perfectly. Constantine, on the other hand, was wearing the formal attire issued by Green Fingers, looking very presentable, and was holding Wendy's hand, ready to head out. Seeing Adele suddenly appear, Wendy was startled and subconsciously let go of his hand and hid it behind her back, like a young girl caught by her parents while meeting a lover. I wouldn't do anything to you. Adele felt a little helpless and had to clear her throat twice, indicating that she meant nothing by it, she was just passing by. Compared to Wendy, Constantine was much more composed. Seeing Wendy startled and letting go of his hand, he didn't try to grab it again, as that would only make Wendy more embarrassed. Captain, is something the matter? Constantine asked frankly. I was just about to take Wendy out to sample the local gourmet food. Adele had originally intended to tell him about her transfer order right then, but seeing the two of them, she changed her mind, deciding instead to find a sailor to move her belongings off the ship first. Nothing for the moment. Adele shook her head, her eyes showing a mix of helplessness and relief. Just make sure you two come back to the ship tonight. I'll discuss the operational plan with you then. Chapter 370, The Second Ingredient. After instructing the sailors to send her belongings back to naval headquarters, Adele ran into Gegran, who was walking unhurriedly from the other side of the corridor. Perfect, I needed to see you about something. Gegran greeted Adele and gestured for her to find a private place. Adele had the sailors put down her things and leave, then entered the office with Gegran. Has your assignment come down yet? Gegran asked, casually sitting on the desk after entering the room, her legs swinging rhythmically in front of Adele. Watching Gegran, Adele had a momentary illusion, as if the demoness before her was not yet an angel, but still that lazy bar owner. I've been transferred from the Snow Wind, and will remain in Baron's Port to investigate the ayahuasca issue discovered earlier. Adele said cautiously, the fleet is temporarily overseen by Tracy, likely to continue leveraging her deterrent power as a former pirate general. She didn't dare tell Gegran her suspicions about William Augustus's open scheme, fearing that Gegran would disregard the bigger picture and confront William Augustus. That's not entirely unacceptable. You are different from Tracy, your ritual to advance to Sequence 5 doesn't require war as an opportunity. However, the Demoness of Despair's requirement to collect despair is better fulfilled on the front lines. Gegran nodded, not paying much attention, and after a brief, light remark, she moved on to the main topic. I came to see you this time because I performed a divination yesterday, about you. Seeing Adele's attention sharpen, Gegran continued, I wanted to divine the dangers you would encounter in the next month, so I used magic mirror divination. And then, what was the result? Adele asked, a little nervously. That's why I came to you. I couldn't see anything, only a ball of white light appeared in the mirror, with no images. Gegran's expression didn't change much, but there was a ripple in her tone. Even with your status, you couldn't divine it. Adele was surprised. Although a demoness's divination skills couldn't compare to a seer's, they were definitely among the top 5 of the 22 pathways. If even Gegran, who had advanced to an angel, had her divination blocked, what kind of trouble was she about to get involved in? Exactly. So, in the coming month, you must act cautiously. It's very likely related to the matter you're investigating. Gegran carefully instructed. Then, do you have any suggestions? Adele hastily asked. My suggestions? Gegran smiled. My suggestion is to have no suggestions. Seeing Adele a bit stunned, Gegran explained, I'm not a professional seer. This kind of divination with unclear signs is the most annoying. Even if I know it's related to the ayahuasca incident you're investigating, I don't know what the relevant method is. Simply put, it could be because you interfered with this matter, so you got involved in a high-level event, or it could be because you didn't do anything, so the hidden danger erupted and pulled you into a high-level event. In this situation, if I casually give you advice, it will interfere with your subsequent judgment, so I don't plan to give you baseless advice. After all, this is your destiny, and you have to learn to face it yourself. Adele fell silent, knowing that Gegran was speaking the truth. Even so, this vague divination was still just as headache-inducing. She was about to nod in agreement when she saw Gegran pull a reddish-brown patent leather box from her embrace and hand it to Adele. This is. Adele took it with a puzzled expression, opened the box, and found a fist-sized, wrinkled, swollen spherical object inside, emitting a greasy smell of animal protein. Upon contact with sunlight, it immediately burned fiercely, its surface gradually cracking like an erupting volcano. Gegran reached out and lightly touched the sphere, covering its surface with a layer of white frost, and the flames gradually extinguished. Lava spider's silk gland. Gegran took a handkerchief from Adele's desk to wipe her fingers, which had gotten some black ash on them, and explained to Adele. I got it from Augustus today, Gegran said casually, my child can't be ordered around by him for free, he always has to bleed a little. I remember, this is one of the alternative main ingredients for an essence faction demoness to advance to Sequence 5. Adele was overjoyed, examining the box for a long time. That's right. Lava spiders are still quite common on the southern continent. About 70% of all known mystical creatures can be found in the primeval jungles here, Gegran said. I didn't just come here to tell you that you'll encounter high-level entities, I have to give you some practical help. This thing costs nearly £5,000 on the market. What do I need to pay? Adele's mind wavered slightly, but in the end, she honestly asked. Although she had been the one being exploited during this period, she had a very clear understanding of her own position and did not subjectively believe that her efforts were worth a mystical item valued at £5,000 just because she had been taking risks. You have already paid the reward. Gegran smiled faintly. Miss Justice of the Tarot Club showed me the blasphemy slate. Sure enough, this was one of the terms of the deal between Audrey and Gegran. This thought popped into Adele's mind, but she still insisted. I traded the blasphemy slate to Miss Justice, and it was Miss Justice who decided to trade the blasphemy slate with you. It actually has nothing to do with me. Well, according to human logic, it indeed has nothing to do with it. Gegran's lips curled slightly, but I am already a mythical creature, and psychological comfort is more important than actual material gain. The item my child found eventually came into my hands, and I, as the mother, am very happy. It's only natural for me to decide to give my child a reward, isn't it? Thank you, mother. Adele felt a bit embarrassed hearing this. She was still unaccustomed to such an address, as she hadn't called anyone that for over 10 years before meeting Gegran. During the fourth epoch, the demoness sect was passed down in the form of demoness families. At that time, the mother was not only the giver and recipient of the potion but also the actual birth mother. Although the demoness families were eventually destroyed, this tradition of relationships was still preserved within the demoness sect, as inheritors, and has always been valued by the demonesses as one of the important means of humanistic inheritance. For more thrilling fanfiction stories like this, check out my channel Fanfic Audiobook. Dive into epic adventures, mysterious realms, and legendary journeys brought to life through immersive storytelling. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing audiobooks.